Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a nice idea if everyone can leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I had been searching for a place to rent for weeks, scrolling through listings every night until my eyes hurt. Most were out of my budget or already taken, but then I found this one. It was small, but the photos looked decent, and the rent was lower than anything else I had seen. The ad said the landlord was showing it in person, no application fee, no credit check, just first month's rent and deposit up front. It almost seemed too easy. I sent a message right away, and within an hour, I got a response. The guy's name was Dan. He gave me the address and told me I could come by that evening to see the place. The quick response was a little weird, but I was desperate to find something, so I didn't think too much about it. When I got there, the house looked different from the pictures. The paint was peeling a bit, and the grass was overgrown. The porch light flickered like it was struggling to stay on. I almost thought I had the wrong place, but when I checked my phone, the address matched. Dan was already waiting for me on the porch. He was tall, maybe in his late 40s, with thinning hair and a face that looked like he hadn't shaved in a few days. He wore a sweatshirt that was too big for him, sleeves pushed up to his elbows. His smile seemed forced, like he had practiced it too many times in the mirror. "You must be Emily," he said, holding out a hand. I shook it, but something about the way he held onto my hand a little too long made my stomach twist. I told myself I was overthinking it. "Come on in," he said, stepping aside. The inside smelled damp, like the house had been sitting empty for a while. The walls had marks where furniture used to be, and the carpet was worn down in places. Dan walked ahead of me, pointing out different things as we moved from room to room. Living room here, kitchen through there, 2 bedrooms down the hall. His voice was steady, but there was something about the way he talked that felt rehearsed, like he was reading from a script. "Bathroom's been updated," he added. "New tiles." I nodded, even though I barely looked. Something about being alone in that house with him made my skin crawl. Then he turned to me. "You want to see the basement?" I hadn't even realized the house had one. "Ah, sure," I said, even though I didn't really want to. He walked ahead, down a narrow hallway, stopping at a door at the very end. He pulled out a key from his pocket and unlocked it. That should have been my first red flag. Why was the basement locked? He pushed the door open and motioned for me to go down first. I hesitated. "What's down there?" He gave me that same strange smile. "Just storage. You know, extra space." I stepped forward and looked down the stairs. It was dark, the kind of dark that swallowed everything past the second step. "I'll get the light," Dan said, reaching inside and flicking a switch. A single bulb came on, dim and yellow. Something felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but every part of me was screaming not to go down there. I forced myself to take a step inside. The air was colder, heavier. The walls were bare concrete, and there wasn't much down there, just an old table, a chair, some cardboard boxes. Then I noticed a door. Not the one I had just walked through, but the inside of it. There was no handle. No knob. Nothing. Just a flat wooden surface with no way to open it from the basement side. I felt a wave of cold panic rush over me. Dan was still standing in the hallway, watching. I turned back toward him. Why doesn't the door have a handle? I tried to keep my voice steady. He looked at me for a second, then shrugged. Oh. Yeah. Meant to fix that. My chest tightened. I needed to leave. Right then. I think I've seen enough, I said quickly, stepping back toward the stairs. Dan didn't move. I kept my eyes on him as I climbed back up, my heart pounding so hard I thought he could hear it. The second I reached the top, I forced out a laugh, pretending like I wasn't shaking inside. Yeah, I don't think this is what I'm looking for. Dan's face didn't change. He just nodded slowly. You sure? He asked. Something about the way he said it made my blood go cold. Yeah, I said quickly, stepping past him. I kept my pace steady, walking toward the front door, not wanting to look like I was panicking. I reached for the doorknob. It didn't turn. I tried again. Still locked. Dan was behind me now, close. Too close. Oops, he said, pulling the keys from his pocket. Guess I locked it. I felt my breath catch. Sorry about that, he said, smiling again, that same fake smile. He unlocked the door slowly, taking his time. The second it clicked open, I yanked it hard and stepped outside. The air felt thinner, easier to breathe. Dan stood in the doorway, watching me. You changed your mind, he said. You got my number. I nodded, pretending like I was considering it, pretending like my hands weren't shaking as I walked down the steps. I got in my car, locked the doors, and drove away without looking back. Later that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The door with no handle. The way he had waited before unlocking the front door. The way he had asked me to go into the basement first. I went back to the listing, but it was gone. I tried searching the address, but I couldn't find any rental history, no records, nothing. I don't know what would have happened if I had walked all the way into that basement. If I had let him close the door behind me. But I know one thing for sure. That wasn't a rental. That house wasn't for rent. And Dan? Dan wasn't a landlord. I left work late that night. Later than usual. The office had mostly emptied out by the time I packed up, just a few people still at their desks, the cleaning crew moving through the halls. I had stayed behind finishing up some reports, and by the time I finally stepped outside, the parking lot was almost empty. The air was cold. The kind that made your breath hang in front of you. I walked to my car, rubbing my hands together, my footsteps echoing in the quiet. There were only a handful of cars left in the lot. Mine was near the back, parked under one of the dim streetlights that flickered every few seconds. I unlocked the car and slid into the driver's seat. The door closed with a heavy thunk, and for a second, I just sat there, rubbing warmth into my fingers. I was tired, and the hum of the engine starting up was almost comforting. I adjusted the rearview mirror slightly, just out of habit. That was when I saw it. A shape. Low, in the back seat. I felt my whole body lock up. It didn't move. For a second, I thought maybe my brain was playing tricks on me. A shadow, a jacket, something I had left back there. But as I stared, my eyes adjusted to the darkness. It wasn't a shadow. It was a person. Someone was lying across the back seat, just low enough that I wouldn't have noticed getting in. My hands went cold. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just sat there, staring at the mirror, waiting for them to do something. They didn't. I could feel my heartbeat hammering against my ribs, every inch of me screaming to get out, to run, but I was afraid to move too fast. Afraid that the second I did, whoever was back there would grab me. Slowly, I reached for the door handle. My fingers barely brushed it when I heard the slightest shift of fabric behind me. A breath. My whole body seized up. They were awake. They were watching me. I forced myself to swallow the panic crawling up my throat. My mind was running through every option at once. If I lunged for the door, would they grab me? If I turned around, would I see their face? Would they have a knife? I didn't want to find out. Keeping my movements slow, I let my hand slip down to the keys still in the ignition. My fingers wrapped around them, steadying myself. Then, in one sharp motion, I turned them hard, cutting the engine. The second the car went silent, I threw the door open and dove out onto the pavement. My knee slammed against the ground, sending a sharp jolt of pain up my leg, but I didn't stop moving. I scrambled away from the car, my breath coming fast and uneven, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my phone. The lot was empty. No one around. Just me, standing under that flickering streetlight, staring at my own car like it was something alive. The door was still open. The inside light cast a glow over the seats, but the back was just out of view. I couldn't see if they were still there. If they had moved. I clenched my phone in my hand, heart pounding. Then, slowly, so slowly, something shifted. A hand. A pale, bony hand slid up from the darkness, gripping the edge of the seat. And then, they sat up. A man. Thin. Clothes dark, almost blending into the shadows. His head tilted forward, hair hanging in his face. I couldn't see his eyes. He didn't rush out. Didn't lunge at me. Just sat there. Watching. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone. I took a step back. Another. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my legs felt like they were stuck in cement. Then, without a sound, he moved. Not toward me. Not fast. Just shifted. Slid across the seat and, in one slow motion, stepped out of the car. The way he moved was wrong. Too smooth. Too practiced. He was taller than I expected. His clothes were loose, hanging off his frame. He kept his head tilted forward, chin almost touching his chest. Then, finally, he looked up. His eyes locked onto mine. And he smiled. A slow, stretched-out grin. Something about it made my stomach drop. It wasn't like he was happy. It was like he was enjoying something I didn't understand. Neither of us spoke. Then, he took a step forward. I bolted. I didn't think. Didn't look back. Just turned and ran, nearly tripping over my own feet as I sprinted across the parking lot. My car keys were still in my hand, but I didn't even consider going back for the car. I just ran. I reached the entrance of the building and yanked on the door, half expecting it to be locked, but it wasn't. I stumbled inside, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The security desk was empty. The night guard usually sat there, but his chair was vacant, the desk light still on. I turned, my pulse hammering so hard I thought I would pass out. Through the glass doors, I could still see my car. Still see the open driver's side door. But the man was gone. I stood there, frozen, waiting for something to happen. For him to reappear. Nothing. The lot was empty. The only sound was the faint hum of the building's ventilation. I reached for my phone with shaking hands and called the police. They came fast. 2 officers pulled up within minutes, their patrol car's lights flashing. I ran outside to meet them, stumbling over my words as I tried to explain. They searched my car, looked around the lot, checked the security cameras. Nothing. No sign of him. No footage. The cameras facing the lot had glitched out, cutting to black for about 10 minutes, the exact 10 minutes when I had been out there. The officers stayed with me while I checked the back seat. It was empty now. Just a faint impression in the seat fabric where someone had been lying. That was 3 weeks ago. I haven't driven my car since. Had it towed. Sold it. I don't know how long he was there. If he had climbed in while I was working late, or if he had been waiting for me before that. I don't know what would have happened if I had just driven home without checking the mirror. But I know one thing. He wasn't in a hurry. He had time. And he had been waiting. I live alone in a small, quiet apartment. It's not much, but it's mine, and I like it. I've always been someone who enjoys peace and solitude, so I never thought much about the little creaks and groans the building makes. But then, something started happening. It was subtle at first. I'd be in bed, trying to sleep, and I'd hear footsteps. Soft, almost like someone was walking on carpet, but my floors are hardwood, so it was strange. The first time, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks. The neighbors upstairs were often up late, and I figured it was just the usual noise. But it didn't stop. Every night, at some point after midnight, I'd hear the steps. Slow, deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth in my apartment. I would sit up in bed, holding my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps would stop if I stayed still long enough. I try to convince myself it was nothing, just the old pipes or the walls settling. I didn't mention it to anyone. It felt too strange to talk about. I didn't want to sound paranoid. But as the days passed, the footsteps became more frequent. They would echo through the hall, across the living room, and down the narrow hallway toward my bedroom door. I tried to ignore it. I tried to rationalize it. The apartment was old, and old buildings make noises. That's what I told myself. Then, one night, I came home from work and noticed something was off. I hadn't been gone long, just a few hours, but when I opened the fridge, I realized something. A container of leftovers I had been looking forward to eating was missing. It wasn't a big deal, but it bothered me. I distinctly remembered putting it in there the night before. I checked the shelves again, as though I'd just misplaced it. But it was gone. I thought maybe I had just forgotten I ate it, but the more I thought about it, the more it didn't add up. I was sure it had been there. That night, as I lay in bed, I tried to push the thought out of my mind. Maybe I had eaten it and not remembered. But as the night dragged on, the footsteps started again. Slow, deliberate, and now it sounded like someone was circling my room. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My stomach turned. I waited. I was terrified, but I didn't want to move. I was afraid that if I did, I'd make the footsteps stop, and I didn't want whoever it was to know I was awake. The pacing continued for what felt like hours, but I didn't dare open my eyes. The next day, I was still shaken. The footsteps had been louder than ever. I checked the apartment, made sure all the locks were secure, and even went so far as to check behind the furniture and in the closets. There was no one there. But the next night, it happened again. This time, the footsteps didn't stop. It was like someone was walking around in my apartment, getting closer and closer to my bedroom. I could hear the sound of someone breathing softly, like they were standing right outside my door. I felt sick to my stomach, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in bed, my heart racing. The breathing stopped, but the footsteps didn't. They circled my room again. When I finally gathered the courage to check, the door was still locked. I crept into the living room, half expecting to find someone hiding in the shadows. But there was no one. Everything was where I'd left it. Except the fridge. I opened it and saw that something else was missing. A few snacks I had left for the next day were gone. A bottle of soda that had been there in the morning, gone. My mind raced. Was someone getting into my apartment? How? I didn't want to call the police. I didn't want to sound crazy. The locks were fine. Everything was in its place except for the food. But the next day, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I decided to take a day off from work and stay home. I figured that if someone was sneaking in, I'd catch them. I stayed in my apartment all day, keeping my ears open for any sounds. I didn't leave for anything. I stayed by the door, peering out the peephole every time I heard a sound. Nothing happened. That night, I was exhausted, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The footsteps hadn't returned, and I thought maybe they wouldn't. Maybe it was all in my head. But when I woke up in the morning, I found the fridge door slightly ajar. I checked inside. More food was gone. That was when I realized what was happening. Someone had been in my apartment. They had been sneaking in at night, taking my food, walking around. The footsteps, the breathing, it wasn't my mind playing tricks. I didn't know who it was or how they were getting in, but I had to do something. I set up a camera that night. I didn't sleep. I waited for hours, watching the live feed on my phone. The whole time, I kept my eyes glued to the screen, waiting for something, anything to happen. And then, around 2 a.m., I saw it. The door handle slowly turned. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My heart nearly stopped. I watched as the door opened, just enough for someone to slip inside. It was dark, but I could make out a figure, tall, wearing a hooded sweatshirt. They walked in quietly, moving toward the kitchen. They didn't turn on the lights. They knew the apartment. They knew where everything was. They went straight for the fridge. I watched as they pulled out a sandwich I had made earlier that week and took a bite. My hands shook as I dialed the police. I told them everything. The food going missing, the footsteps, the figure. When they arrived, they found nothing. No sign of anyone in the apartment. The door was still locked. The windows were fine. But the camera had caught everything. They couldn't explain how the person had gotten in. The locks weren't tampered with. But they promised to look into it. Since then, I've installed new locks. I've kept the apartment locked tight, and I'm much more cautious about who I let in. The footsteps have stopped for now, but I can't shake the feeling that someone is still watching me. I've stopped going out late. I make sure I'm never alone in the apartment at night. I don't know who it was or how they got in, but I'm never going to feel safe in this place again. I was desperate for work. It had been months since I had anything even close to a decent job. The bills were piling up, and I had already borrowed money from friends, which was humiliating. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt this hopeless. So when I got the call about the interview, I thought, this is it. This is my chance. The job posting didn't seem off at first. It was for an entry-level office position, perfect for someone like me who didn't have much experience. The company said they were a small but growing tech firm. Their office was on a side street not far from where I lived, which was convenient, and the pay they advertised was enough to get me back on my feet. I figured, what did I have to lose? I dressed up in my best shirt, even though it wasn't exactly professional, and walked to the building. It was a small, older building. Nothing fancy, but that didn't bother me. It was a job interview, not a high society gala. The moment I stepped into the lobby, I knew something was off. The place felt too quiet, too empty. The floors were made of scuffed tile, and the walls were a dull beige. There was no receptionist at the desk, which I thought was strange. The office should have at least one person greeting visitors, right? But the area was silent, and I didn't hear any sounds of activity or phones ringing. Just a stale air that felt a bit too thick to breathe in comfortably. I stood there for a few moments, unsure of what to do. There was no sign indicating where to go, no instructions on the walls. Just the receptionist desk that led to an open hallway. I checked my phone for the address one more time to make sure I was in the right place. Sure enough, it matched. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to walk toward the hallway. I figured I'd find someone or something soon enough. I wasn't going to leave. I had nothing else. As I walked down the hall, I noticed how unusually still it was. The lights above flickered every few seconds, casting long, uneven shadows. The walls were bare, and the only thing that stood out was a door at the far end of the hall. It was closed, but not locked. I knocked on it lightly, unsure whether I should just open it. When no one responded, I decided to try the handle. It opened, and I stepped inside. The room was completely empty. No furniture, no papers, nothing. Just bare walls and a cracked window. I didn't know what to think. This was where I was supposed to have an interview. I checked my watch. I was on time, maybe a little early. I figured I should wait a bit longer. I sat down on the floor, my back against the cold wall, trying not to panic. Maybe this was some weird office space. Maybe they just didn't care about the presentation. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was no reason for an office like this to look so abandoned. A part of me considered just leaving, but I knew I couldn't afford to. I needed this job. I heard the click of a door behind me. It was the same one I had come through, the only way in or out. I turned around quickly, expecting to see someone standing there, but the door was shut. I stared at it for a moment, unsure of whether I had imagined the sound. But then I heard it again, this time louder, more deliberate. The door was slowly starting to open. I stood up quickly, heart pounding, as the door creaked open. I expected to see the person who had been supposed to interview me, but no one came in. There was only an empty space. A few seconds passed, and then the door slammed shut. That's when I noticed something strange. The door behind me had been locked. I had checked it earlier when I walked in, and it had been open. But now, it was locked. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. My panic grew. I pulled harder, but the door wouldn't open. I banged my fist against it, but it felt like the whole place had swallowed me up. I had no way out. I turned around and saw the only other door in the room. It wasn't locked, but I didn't want to risk finding out what was behind it. I could feel the walls closing in. I had to do something. Then, the phone on the wall rang. I froze. I don't know why, but I walked over to it. It was the only thing in the room that wasn't silent. My hands were trembling as I picked up the receiver. There was no dial tone, just a faint clicking sound on the other end. "Hello?" I asked, my voice coming out hoarse. A breath. A pause. Then a low voice, one I didn't recognize. "You're not supposed to be here." My stomach twisted. My throat closed up. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice shaking. "You don't belong here," the voice repeated. I slammed the receiver down, my breath coming faster now. This wasn't right. None of this was right. I turned toward the door I hadn't opened yet, the one leading deeper into the building. Something inside me screamed to leave, to get out, but I didn't know how. The door I came through was still locked, and there was no other way out. I grabbed the handle, praying it would open. To my relief, it did. I stepped through quickly, hoping I was getting away from whatever was going on, but the hallway was just as empty and quiet as before. No one was there. I felt like I was in some kind of trap, and the worst part was that no one knew where I was. I ran toward the nearest exit and pulled at the door, desperate. The door opened, and I felt the cool night air rush in, along with a sense of relief. I didn't look back. I didn't even stop to see if anyone had followed me. I ran all the way to the street, heart hammering in my chest. I don't know who was behind that office or why it felt so off, but I never went back. The next day, I tried calling the number they'd given me for the interview, but it was disconnected. There was no trace of the company. No trace of the building. I even walked back to the street where the office had been, and the place was gone. I don't know if I just imagined the whole thing or if it was something else entirely. I don't care. I'm just glad I'm out of there. It was a Wednesday night, and I had just wrapped up a long shift at work. I was exhausted, and all I wanted was to get home, have a hot shower, and collapse into bed. The roads were mostly empty, just the occasional car here and there, and the sky was a dull gray-black with the moon barely visible behind the clouds. I could feel the fatigue setting in, but the drive was uneventful until I reached the outskirts of town. That's when everything started to feel wrong. I was driving down a stretch of road I usually took, one that was pretty dark with no streetlights. It was fine during the day, but at night, I always felt a little on edge, especially after everything that had been happening lately with break-ins in the neighborhood. But I pushed the feeling aside. I just wanted to get home. Then, out of nowhere, I saw the flashing lights in my rearview mirror. I didn't think too much of it at first. I figured I had been speeding or something, though I didn't remember going over the speed limit. Still, I slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. As I came to a stop, I glanced in the mirror again. The car behind me wasn't a marked police car. It was a dark sedan, unmarked, but the lights flashing on top were unmistakable. Red and blue, the kind you would expect from a cop car. I figured it could have been a plainclothes officer or someone working in an undercover car, so I didn't immediately feel like something was wrong. I sat there for a few moments, my hands resting on the steering wheel. I didn't roll down my window just yet because, honestly, I was too tired to deal with whatever the situation was. It was probably just a routine stop. But then, I noticed something that set my nerves on edge. The officer, if that's even what they were, wasn't approaching my car. I waited a few more seconds, expecting them to walk up to my window, but instead, they just sat in their car behind me. I started to feel a little uneasy. It was too quiet. There were no sounds of approaching footsteps, no movement. Just the occasional buzz of the car's lights and the soft hum of my engine. I reached over and unlocked my phone, my fingers moving on instinct. I didn't even know what I was going to do yet, but I typed in 911 and hit call. As the line rang, I glanced in the side mirror. The person behind me still wasn't moving. It felt like they were waiting for something, like they were watching me, but they weren't coming any closer. Finally, 911 answered. 911, what's your emergency? Hi, I'm on road name, and I've just been pulled over by a car with flashing lights. I think it's a police car, but they haven't approached yet. I just wanted to check if someone is supposed to be stopping me. It doesn't feel right. Can you confirm your location for me? The operator asked. I quickly looked around, trying to figure out where I was. I didn't want to sound panicked, but it was hard to think straight with the adrenaline kicking in. I'm on road name about a mile past the old gas station. All right, I've got it, she said, and I could hear the clicking of keys in the background. Just stay on the line with me. Let me check for you. I looked at the car behind me again. It was still there, the lights spinning. But there was no sign of movement from the officer or whoever was in that car. Ma'am, I've checked, the dispatcher's voice came through after a moment. There are no officers in that area right now. Are you sure it's a police car? My heart sank. I'm looking at the car right now. It has lights on top, red and blue. I don't know what to tell you, but it's definitely a police car. The dispatcher's voice sounded calm, but there was something about the way she said it that made me shiver. Okay, I need you to stay on the line. Do not engage with the driver. I'm sending someone out there right now. Can you tell me if they've gotten out of the car yet? I glanced in the rearview mirror again, trying to steady my breathing. No. They're just sitting there. The dispatcher was silent for a moment, and I could feel my heart racing now. I looked at the flashing lights again, wondering if I was losing my mind. It didn't make sense. Why hadn't this person come up to my window yet? I need you to keep your doors locked and your windows up, the dispatcher said, her voice now firm, direct. If they approach your car, don't roll down the window. Just stay on the line with me. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, and I did what she asked. I pressed my back into the seat, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. It felt like time was slowing down, like every second was stretching out longer than it should. I kept glancing in the mirror, but the car was still there, still sitting motionless. And then, just like that, the car's lights shut off. Completely. In an instant. It was like someone had turned them off, leaving the road dark again, except for the headlights of my own car. I still couldn't see any movement in the other vehicle, and I knew I couldn't sit there forever. They've turned off their lights, I said to the dispatcher. They're just sitting there. It's so strange. What should I do? Stay calm, she said. The officers will be there soon. Just stay where you are. It felt like hours had passed, but in reality, it was probably only a few minutes. I didn't dare to move. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I kept my phone pressed to my ear. Just then, the car behind me started moving slowly, creeping forward in a way that made my skin crawl. They didn't turn on their lights again. Instead, they just moved forward slowly, as though they were trying to slip by unnoticed. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I threw my car into gear and drove off, not looking back. I didn't stop until I was several miles down the road, close to a gas station. I pulled over, my hands still shaking as I waited for the police to call me back. I never saw that car again. They never followed me. When the police did finally arrive, they told me there had been reports of people impersonating officers in the area. They said it wasn't uncommon for someone to use lights to pull over unsuspecting drivers. But the fact that they hadn't gotten out of the car, that they hadn't said a word, still bothered me. There was something wrong about it, something that I couldn't shake. I didn't take that route home again for weeks. I was on a long drive, heading down some back roads on a road trip across the state. I had no real destination in mind, just a vague idea of exploring and seeing where the road would take me. By the time I reached the area around sunset, I had been driving for hours, and I was starting to get tired. There was a rest area up ahead, so I figured I'd stop, stretch my legs, grab a snack, and maybe take a quick nap in the car before continuing on. When I pulled in, the place was eerily quiet. I didn't expect much. It was a small, deserted spot along the highway. The rest area consisted of a couple of picnic tables, a few old, weathered trash cans, and one of those rundown bathrooms that hadn't seen any maintenance in years. The whole place felt like it hadn't been used in ages, but I figured it would be fine for a quick break. There wasn't another car in sight. I parked my car near the edge of the lot, away from the picnic area, and got out. The air was still warm from the day, but there was a chill in the breeze that made me pull my jacket tighter. I started to walk toward the bathrooms to wash my hands, but halfway there, I heard the sound of tires on gravel. I looked over, and a van had pulled in next to my car. It was a white van, a bit old and beat up, and there was nothing unusual about it at first glance. But I could tell right away something wasn't right. The way it pulled in, too close to my car, and the way the driver didn't seem to stop until the van was nearly on top of my vehicle, it felt deliberate. It felt wrong. I didn't think much of it, though. People stop at rest areas all the time. Maybe they were just looking for a place to park, like I was. But the driver didn't get out of the van right away. Instead, he sat there, his engine idling, for a few moments too long. I started walking toward the bathroom again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. When I looked over my shoulder, I saw the driver get out of the van. He was tall, maybe in his mid-40s, wearing a plain brown jacket and jeans. He didn't look like anything out of the ordinary, but there was something in the way he moved, like he wasn't entirely comfortable in his own skin. He took a few slow steps toward me, and I could feel my stomach twist. I tried to dismiss the feeling. I mean, he was probably just another traveler, right? But then he spoke. "Hey there," the man called out, his voice a little too loud, like he was trying too hard to be friendly. "I'm a bit lost. Can you help me out?" I stopped walking, and instinctively, I took a step back. Something about him made me want to put distance between us. Sure. What's up?" I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. His gaze kept shifting, like he wasn't looking directly at me, but somewhere behind me. Somewhere in the direction of my car, I realized. It wasn't just the van's location that had me on edge, it was the way his eyes kept flicking toward the back of it, like he was more interested in something there than in me. "I'm looking for, name of town," he said, scratching his head like he wasn't sure about his own question. "You know the way from here?" I tried to think of the best route, but I found myself hesitating. The way he was acting, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, glancing back at the van every few seconds, made my instincts kick in. My stomach twisted in a way I couldn't explain. "Yeah, I think it's just up the road a little bit." "You can't miss it," I said, my voice almost too casual, like I was trying to convince myself that everything was fine. But the man didn't move. He didn't even thank me. Instead, he kept standing there, looking over at my car, and then back at the van. It was like he was waiting for something. Or like he was sizing me up. I suddenly realized that he hadn't even asked for directions to a specific location, just a general town. It felt off. "You sure you're all right?" I asked, my voice a little more sharp now. "Oh, yeah," the man said with a nervous laugh. He looked at the van again. His hand twitched at his side, like he was debating whether to reach for something, or maybe I just imagined it. But whatever it was, I could feel it in the air, heavy and strange. I started to walk away, a little faster than before, and that's when he finally spoke again. "I could use a little help with something," he said, his voice quieter now, like he was trying to keep it from carrying. But I heard him clear as day. "I've got some things in the back of the van I need to move. You got a second?" My stomach dropped. The words didn't immediately make sense to me, but in that moment, it felt like everything inside me was screaming to get away. He wasn't asking for help with directions anymore. It wasn't just a casual request. There was something hidden in the way he said it. I didn't wait around. I didn't even glance back. I turned on my heel and headed straight for my car. My heart was pounding now, and I had the overwhelming urge to leave as quickly as possible. I could hear him calling out behind me, but I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. As I reached my car, I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking. I got in and slammed the door, locking it as quickly as I could. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't need to. I knew he was still standing there, just out of sight. But I wasn't about to give him the chance to get any closer. I drove off, and I didn't stop again until I was well out of the area. It wasn't until I was a few miles down the road that I finally took a breath. My hands were still shaking, and my chest was tight. I kept thinking about that man, how he kept glancing at the back of his van. How he had never looked at me directly, but instead, always at the van. I didn't stop again until I reached the next town. And I didn't take another back road for the rest of the trip. I've been trying to shake this feeling for a while now, but every time I think about it, I get that same knot in my stomach. It happened a few weeks ago, but it feels like it just happened yesterday. I've never been the type to believe in anything weird, but this was something that I can't explain. It started when I was at this little coffee shop I usually go to. I was meeting a friend, but she canceled last minute, so I just stayed to enjoy my coffee. I don't know why, but that day I was feeling off. Nothing specific, but I had this weird sensation that something wasn't right. I ignored it, though. I was tired, and I didn't feel like making a scene, so I just pulled out my phone and tried to distract myself with some emails. After about an hour of sitting there, I had to use the bathroom. I'm not one of those people who just goes when I need to, but that day, I really did. I got up, walked across the floor, and went into the bathroom. It was a small one, just a single stall, like most coffee shops have. There was a little hand dryer on the wall, some scratchy paper towels, and a single mirror. Nothing special. I used the restroom and washed my hands, then pulled the door handle to leave. That's when I realized something was wrong. The door wouldn't budge. At first, I thought maybe it had just stuck. I pulled harder, but it still wouldn't open. I pressed my shoulder against it and tried again. Nothing. I started feeling a little panicked, but I wasn't thinking straight. Maybe it was just stuck, right? So I pressed on the door harder, slamming my body into it, but it didn't give. I could feel my heart starting to race. I could hear the quiet hum of the cafe outside the bathroom, but no one came to check on me. I thought I heard people talking, but no one came to see why I was taking so long. I started pounding on the door, shouting for help, but even as I did, the panic was growing in me. It was hard to explain, but it was like I was suddenly hyper-aware of everything. The air felt colder, and I noticed how quiet it had gotten outside the bathroom. At first, I thought I might just be overreacting. After all, I had just been in a small coffee shop where people were chatting and getting their orders. Why wasn't anyone responding to me? I didn't want to keep banging on the door, but I felt like I had no choice. I was stuck. The thought of someone seeing me struggle like that made me feel worse, but I had to get out. I tried calling for help, but I could barely hear my own voice. It felt muffled, like the air around me had thickened. The quiet in the coffee shop outside was becoming unnerving. I thought I could hear some footsteps faintly, but it felt distant, almost like someone was walking away from the door. Finally, I gathered all my strength and gave the door one last push. This time, the door gave way with a loud screech as it opened slightly. My heart was pounding, and I stepped back, almost ready to fall. But when I looked outside, it made no sense. The entire cafe was empty. The chairs were pushed in at the tables, and there was no sign of anyone. No baristas behind the counter. Not a single person sitting in the seats. The place was completely still. I froze in place. I thought I had missed something. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But there was no one. The cafe, which just a few minutes ago had been full of people, was now totally silent and devoid of anyone. I stepped out of the bathroom slowly, the door swinging behind me with a low creak. My footsteps echoed on the tile, and I walked across the room, looking around in disbelief. There was no one. No one at the counter. No one in line. No one sitting at the tables. The music, which had been playing softly before, was now just off. Like it had been paused, and no one bothered to turn it back on. I called out, my voice shaking. "Hello? Is anyone here?" Nothing. No response. I walked to the counter, thinking maybe the workers were just in the back. I looked through the little window behind the counter, but there was no one. Not even a single cup on the counter. It was as though the entire place had just emptied out. But there were no signs of a rush or an abrupt exit. It didn't make sense. I thought maybe I was losing my mind. But then I noticed the door. The door to the outside was still locked. It hadn't been locked when I had come in. I remembered seeing it open when I walked in earlier. It had been propped open by a small mat near the door, but now it was shut tightly, and I couldn't figure out how to open it. I pulled at the handle, trying to make sense of what was happening. But it wouldn't budge. I was locked inside. The panic started creeping up again. My head was spinning as I searched for someone, anyone. But it was just me in that empty room. I finally ran to the back, where the storage area and the kitchen were. But when I opened that door, it was like I was stepping into a completely different space. There was nothing. No kitchen. No sinks. No refrigerators. Just a blank wall. It was as though the room had been erased entirely. I could feel my chest tighten. My breath was shallow, and I was starting to feel dizzy. What was happening? Where had everyone gone? Why was everything so still? I ran back to the front of the cafe and tried the door one more time, my hands trembling. This time, it opened. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped outside, and I felt a rush of cool air hit me in the face. I didn't even know where I was anymore. The street was empty, and there were no cars. The coffee shop, which had been bustling not long before, was now just another dark building in the distance. I don't know how I got home that night. I just remember driving in a daze, trying to make sense of it all. I've been back to that coffee shop a couple of times since then, but it's never been the same. I swear, I've never seen it so full of people again. And whenever I drive by, I always feel a chill, like something is off. But I don't go inside anymore. I don't think I ever will. I never really thought anything of it when I decided to take that shortcut through the woods. It was a well-known trail, used by a lot of people who lived around the area, so I didn't think twice about it. I'd been walking that same route for years, and I'd never had a problem. It was a quiet path through the trees that led me home in half the time it would have taken to walk around. That day, though, I should have trusted my gut when it started to feel like something was off. It was late in the afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip behind the trees, and the air had that cool edge to it. I'd worked late and was tired, just wanting to get home. I figured taking the trail would be quicker, and the weather had been nice, so why not? The trail was a little narrower than usual after some rain earlier in the week, but it wasn't too bad. I was about halfway through when I first noticed him. I didn't really think much of it at first. It was a guy, probably in his 40s, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. Nothing unusual. But then I realized, after I passed a few trees, that I could still hear his footsteps behind me. I'd been walking steadily, but when I sped up a bit, I noticed his steps matched my pace exactly. He wasn't running, just walking at a normal speed, but every time I moved, he did, too. At first, I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just walking the same way, right? The path wasn't that wide, and there were only a few ways to go. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I glanced over my shoulder quickly, and he was still there, just a few steps behind me. His face was obscured by the hood, but his posture seemed odd. He wasn't walking like most people do. It was more like he was gliding, almost like his steps were too steady, too controlled. I tried to shake it off. It was probably just my nerves. Maybe he was just another person walking the same trail, nothing to worry about. But the longer I walked, the more uncomfortable I became. I tried to speed up, thinking I'd outpace him. But the guy did the same. It was like he was mimicking my every move. I kept walking faster, then slower, trying to throw him off. But he kept matching my pace. Always behind me. Never too far, but never too close either. Just there. My breath quickened. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. My mind started racing, thinking of all the possibilities. Was he following me? I didn't know. It was just too weird. I didn't know if I should confront him or keep walking. I decided to try something. I stopped dead in my tracks, hoping that would confuse him. But, just like before, he stopped at the exact same moment. It was as if he had been waiting for me to make a move. I didn't know what to do. I turned around and looked at him fully, trying to gauge his reaction. The guy still hadn't moved. He just stood there, a few feet away from me, in the middle of the trail. He wasn't doing anything threatening, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about him. I couldn't see his face clearly, but his posture seemed stiff, unnatural even. "Hey," I called out, trying to sound confident, but my voice came out shaky. "Are you okay?" He didn't answer. He just stood there, still, like he was waiting for me to make another move. My pulse was pounding in my ears. I could feel a cold sweat trickling down my back. The woods around us were unnervingly quiet, not a single bird chirping or wind blowing. It was as if the whole forest had stopped, waiting. I didn't know what he was waiting for. I took a few slow steps back, and, for the first time, he moved. But it wasn't anything I expected. He didn't turn to walk away or even acknowledge my presence. Instead, he took a step forward, slow, deliberate, like he was closing the distance between us. I felt my stomach drop. Something wasn't right, and it hit me then. This wasn't just some guy walking on the same trail. This was someone who had been following me. And now, he was moving closer. I turned and started walking quickly, not running, but faster than before. My feet slapped against the dirt, and I could hear the crunch of the ground beneath me. But then, I heard it again. His footsteps, matching mine. I could feel him getting closer. Every time I sped up, he matched me, staying just far enough away that I couldn't catch him in my peripheral vision, but close enough to know he was there. I glanced over my shoulder again. This time, I could see him more clearly. He was taller than I had thought, his frame looming in the twilight. He wasn't hurrying, but he wasn't far behind either. I picked up my pace even more. My legs were aching, and I could feel the weight of panic start to press in on me, but I didn't stop. I had to get out of the woods. I was almost to the clearing when I heard him again, closer this time, his breathing. It was slow, deliberate, like he wasn't out of breath. It was almost like he wasn't even trying to exert any effort. I couldn't take it anymore. My mind was screaming for me to turn around, to do something, anything, but I was frozen. I could barely breathe. My thoughts were all tangled up. Finally, I made a decision. I turned sharply, heading off the path toward a small trail that led off to the left. I knew it would be longer, but it was my only shot. If I could make it to the street, to the lights, to the traffic, I'd be safe. I glanced back once more, but this time he was still there. Not running after me. Not trying to stop me. Just walking, as though he knew I'd take this turn. I didn't dare look back again. I just kept going, faster now, heart pounding in my chest. I heard his footsteps for a few more moments, but they started to fade, and I didn't stop until I reached the street. I could barely see the lights of the houses in the distance, but they were enough to remind me that I was out of the woods. Safe, for the moment. I haven't seen the guy again, and I don't want to. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I know one thing, there's no way I'll be taking that trail again. It was late, past midnight, when I left the party. I had been there for a few hours, trying to unwind after a long work week. Everyone was getting pretty rowdy, but I didn't feel like staying much longer. I had arranged for a rideshare to pick me up, and I wasn't far from home, so I figured I could get out of there and head back to my apartment without much trouble. I was a little tipsy, but not drunk, and I had the app open on my phone, keeping an eye on the map to make sure I'd get picked up. When the car pulled up, I didn't think twice. I assumed it was the right one. It was a black sedan, which was what the app had said, and it didn't look out of the ordinary. I walked up to the car, opened the door, and slid into the back seat. I glanced at the driver, and he was just sitting there, not really looking at me. He had dark hair and a thick beard, maybe in his late 30s. I was half expecting him to greet me or say something about where I was headed, but instead, he just said, "Hey, my name." It caught me off guard. My name wasn't common, so I wasn't used to people saying it like that unless they knew me personally. I looked at him, and that's when I realized something was wrong. His voice was too calm, too familiar in a way that didn't make sense. Hi, I said, trying to keep it casual, not wanting to make things awkward. "You're my ride, right?" He nodded slowly, but he didn't answer. I figured he was just a little tired or whatever, so I let it go. The car started moving, and I checked the app again, expecting it to show that we were headed in the right direction. But when I looked at the map, I noticed something strange. We were going the wrong way. The app was showing that we were moving farther away from my apartment, not closer. My stomach dropped a little, but I tried to push the worry out of my head. Maybe the driver was just taking a different route, or there was traffic. I waited a few moments before I spoke again. "Hey, I think you're going the wrong way, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. I'm supposed to go towards street name. He didn't respond right away. His hand stayed tightly on the wheel, and he didn't look at me. The silence felt strange, like he was waiting for something. After a few seconds, he finally spoke, but his voice was colder this time. I know where you're going. That didn't sit right with me. Something about the way he said it, the way he didn't even turn his head to look at me, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My heart started to race, and I quickly looked out the window, trying to get my bearings. But we were in a part of the city I didn't recognize, and the streetlights were sparse, making it hard to tell exactly where we were. I reached for my phone, but before I could unlock it, I heard the click. The doors had locked. I didn't even see him do it, but I heard the unmistakable sound. It sent a jolt of panic through me. Why are you locking the doors? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but my hands were shaking. I'm just making sure we don't get interrupted, he said. His voice was flat, almost as if he were telling me something mundane. That was the moment I realized this was not a typical rideshare. Something was wrong. My mind raced through all the scenarios, but none of them were good. I needed to get out of the car. I needed to get away from him. I kept telling myself that I would be fine, but the dread was creeping in fast. I thought about asking him to pull over, but what if he didn't? What if he wouldn't? What if he had no intention of stopping? I couldn't risk it. I decided to text a friend. I quickly typed out a message, telling her I was in a car with a driver who was acting strange and that I wasn't sure where I was. I hit send, praying that she would see it and call me or do something. As I waited for the message to go through, I tried to keep my composure. I looked out the window again, trying to make sense of the surroundings, but the streets were dark and there was nobody around. I couldn't see any familiar landmarks. I tried to focus on the car, to focus on what was happening, but the silence between us was suffocating. The tension in the air felt thick. A few moments passed, and I glanced back at the driver. He wasn't looking at me, but I could feel his attention on me, like he was waiting for me to make a move. My pulse quickened. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit here and let him take me wherever he wanted to go. I needed to get out of the car, even if it meant jumping out at a stoplight. I reached for the door handle, but before I could even touch it, the driver turned his head slightly, just enough for me to see his eyes in the rearview mirror. Don't try anything, he said, his voice now low and menacing. That was it. I couldn't wait any longer. I didn't care if it was dangerous. I had to get out. I quickly pulled at the door handle, hoping it was just stuck, but it didn't budge. I pressed against the door with my shoulder, trying to pry it open, but it felt like the door was sealed shut. Panic rose in my chest, and I started to scream, banging on the window. Help! Somebody help me! I couldn't keep it in anymore. The car suddenly jerked to a stop, and I felt a rush of fear hit me like a wave. I looked out the window, desperate for someone to see me, but the street was empty. No one in sight. No lights, no noise. Just me and him, alone on this desolate road. He didn't say anything for a while. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke again. You should have stayed quiet. That's when I knew if I didn't do something, this was going to end badly. I was running out of options. I couldn't afford to wait any longer. I didn't even think. I threw myself toward the door again, my shoulder slamming into it, and finally, it gave way. The door clicked open just enough for me to shove it fully open. Without thinking, I jumped out of the car and ran, not knowing where I was or what direction I was heading in, but I didn't care. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I ran blindly through the streets, my only thought being to get as far away from that car, from him, as possible. I didn't stop until I found a convenience store that was still open. I ran inside, breathless, and told the clerk what had happened. She immediately called the police, and I gave them all the details I could. The officer who arrived later told me they found the car parked a few blocks away, but the driver was gone. No sign of him, no trace. The car was registered to an unknown owner, and they couldn't find any information on him. I still don't know what his intentions were, but I'm thankful I trusted my instincts and got out of that car when I did. I had been in the hospital for what felt like forever. A couple of weeks at least, though I'd lost track of time in between the pain meds and the haze from the surgery. It was a routine procedure, nothing too serious, but I had complications, and I ended up staying far longer than I expected. At first, everything was okay. I was mostly doped up, so I spent most of my time in and out of sleep. My room was quiet, except for the soft beeping of the machines and the occasional shuffle of nurses and staff outside my door. I wasn't alone. I had visitors here and there, but most of the time, I was by myself. Which wasn't really an issue, to be honest. I wasn't exactly in the mood for company. But then, one night, things started to feel off. I woke up around 3 a.m., not fully awake but enough to notice the shape in the doorway. At first, I thought it was a nurse, maybe coming in to check on me, but then I realized the figure wasn't moving. It was just standing there. A man, tall, but I couldn't make out his features in the dim light of the hallway. I figured it was just my eyes adjusting. I had just come out of a deep sleep after all, so I chalked it up to grogginess. Still, something about it didn't sit right with me. I tried to call out, but my throat felt dry and scratchy, like I had forgotten how to speak. I blinked again, and the figure was gone. Just like that. I wasn't sure if I had dreamed it. Maybe it was the pain meds messing with my head. I didn't know, but the next morning, I mentioned it to one of the nurses when she came in. I told her that I'd seen a man standing by the door, and that it freaked me out. She looked at me with a kind smile. You probably just woke up from a deep sleep, and your mind was playing tricks on you. It happens sometimes, especially after surgery. I didn't argue with her. It made sense, I guess. But deep down, I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The memory of that figure just standing there, not moving or saying anything, stuck with me. It made my skin crawl. But I tried to push it out of my mind. Maybe it was just the meds. Or a bad dream. But then it happened again. A few nights later, I woke up at around the same time, 3 a.m., and there he was again. Standing in the doorway. I could make out more details this time, like the outline of his body in the shadowed light, but still, I couldn't see his face. He was just standing there, motionless, watching me. I felt my heart race. My first instinct was to yell, but I still couldn't speak. It was like I was frozen, unable to move or do anything. I tried to reach for my call button, but my hand felt heavy. Then, just like before, he vanished. One moment he was there, the next, nothing. I don't know how long I lay there afterward, just staring at the door. Was I imagining it? Was I just losing my mind? I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew what I'd seen. I wasn't crazy. The next morning, I told the nurse again. I was getting more worked up, even though I tried to stay calm. I saw him again last night. The man standing in the doorway. He's there every night. She gave me that same look, the kind of "don't worry, it's all in your head" look. Are you sure it wasn't just a dream, or maybe the medication? I'm sure, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm not imagining it. I saw him. He's real. She nodded, but her face told me she didn't believe me. She suggested I try to get some rest and left the room. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the door, half expecting him to appear again. But nothing happened. No footsteps, no figure. Just silence. The following night, though, he came again. But this time, I was prepared. I had to see his face. I had to know who he was. I blinked awake at the usual hour, and there he was, standing in the same spot by the door. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears as I watched him, my breath shallow. He didn't move. He just stood there, his figure clear now in the low light. I could tell that he was watching me, but there was still no sound. No movement. I must have finally found my voice, because I shouted, "Who are you?" But as soon as I spoke, he was gone. Just disappeared. Again, nothing. I was terrified. My mind was racing, and I could feel myself starting to panic. I slammed my hand against the call button, hoping someone would come in and calm me down. A nurse came in within seconds, probably startled by how quickly I pressed it. "What happened?" she asked, sounding genuinely concerned now. There was someone in the doorway. Again. A man. He's standing there every night. "Are you sure you're not still a little disoriented?" she asked. "You've been under a lot of stress with your surgery." I shook my head violently. "No. He's real. He's been there every night, and I need you to believe me." She hesitated, then sighed. "I'll call security to check the area. Maybe they'll see something." A few minutes later, security came and checked the entire hallway. They checked the cameras, the lights, the halls, nothing. No one was there. It was as if the man had never existed. The nurses and security kept insisting that I was just seeing things. Maybe it was the medication, they said. Maybe it was the stress, the recovery, the pain. But I knew what I had seen. That night, I stayed awake, my eyes locked on the door. I wasn't going to let him catch me off guard again. But the man didn't come back. Or so I thought. The next morning, as I was finally starting to feel like I might be getting some answers, one of the nurses came in with a look on her face that I hadn't seen before. She seemed concerned. "Can you tell me again what you saw?" she asked softly. I repeated the same thing I had been saying every day. A man. In the doorway. Every night. She nodded, her expression unreadable. "We found something in the security footage." My stomach dropped. They'd seen him? They had to have. "He's never been there," she said slowly. "There's no man. There's no footage. There's nothing." I felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine. They still didn't believe me. They couldn't. But the next few days passed without any more visits from the man. Nothing. Like he had vanished completely. But the fear stayed. Because if they couldn't see him, and he wasn't on the cameras, then who was standing in that doorway every night? It was supposed to be a relaxing trip. My girlfriend and I had been planning it for months. A week-long vacation to a small beach town. Just the two of us, away from everything, in a cozy little Airbnb by the shore. We were excited. I was excited. Life had been stressful for both of us, so this was the perfect way to unwind. No worries, just the ocean, good food, and each other's company. We spent our days on the beach, walking around the town, and just taking in the sights. We took photos everywhere, of the beach, the sunsets, the little cafes we stopped at. It was the kind of vacation that felt like we were living in a postcard. I had my camera with me the whole time, snapping pictures whenever something caught my eye. We both enjoyed looking at the pictures as we went along, always laughing at how goofy we looked in some of them, or how amazing the scenery was. On the 5th day, we decided to explore a nearby lighthouse that was on the edge of town. It was about a 20-minute walk from where we were staying, so we decided to stroll there in the late afternoon. We took our time, enjoying the fresh air, stopping to take photos along the way. I snapped a few of her near the lighthouse as she gazed out at the ocean. She looked beautiful, the soft light from the setting sun casting a warm glow on her face. I remember smiling as I clicked the camera, feeling content. Afterward, we made our way to the lighthouse itself, a little higher up on the cliff, looking out over the water. We took more pictures. A few of us together. A few of just the lighthouse and the rocks below. We were in high spirits, laughing, talking about random things, soaking up the moment. It was a perfect day. That night, we came back to the Airbnb, tired but happy. We grabbed dinner from a local seafood place and sat out on the deck with a bottle of wine, talking and laughing some more. As we finished eating, she suggested we look through the photos. I was happy to do it. I was always eager to see what we had captured. We went inside, got comfortable, and started scrolling through the pictures. We got to the ones we had taken earlier at the lighthouse. The first one was of her, standing near the base of the lighthouse, looking out over the water. Nothing out of the ordinary. She was smiling, looking peaceful. But then we got to the next one. The second photo I took of her. She was standing in the same spot, but this time, there was something in the background. A man. A tall, thin figure standing near the edge of the rocks, just barely visible in the distance. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was a tourist or another person enjoying the view. But then we got to the next picture. The one where I had taken a photo of her, sitting on the steps of the lighthouse. There was the same man, this time a little closer, standing against the lighthouse, his back turned toward us, just barely peeking into the frame. I could see more of his features now, tall, with dark, messy hair, wearing a dark jacket. Still far enough away that we hadn't noticed him in the moment. I felt a slight unease, but I didn't want to mention it right away. I thought maybe it was just coincidence. Maybe he was part of a larger group of people, or just a local who liked to go to the lighthouse at that time of day. I don't know why, but something about him just felt off. We scrolled through a few more photos, ones taken at a different part of the town, along the beach, near a cafe. Then, I froze. In every single one of the photos, no matter the location, the man was there. In one, he was barely visible in the background, sitting on a bench, watching us. In another, he was in the far distance, standing by a tree near the beach, looking toward the camera. In one more, he was on a path near a cafe, staring directly at us, right in the middle of the picture. His expression was unreadable, but there was something unnerving about it. I couldn't breathe. I scrolled through more pictures, the same man showing up in every single one. At first, he was distant. In the background, far enough that we never noticed him when we were taking the photos. But as the days went on, he appeared closer. He was in one picture at the local market, just a few steps behind me. In another, he was sitting on a bench, facing toward the camera as if waiting for us. There were no signs of him in the moment, nothing that had caught our attention while we were actually there. But now, looking at the photos, I could see him in every frame, his face starting to come into focus. My heart was pounding. I looked over at my girlfriend, her face pale, eyes wide. She was quiet, looking at the photos, not saying anything. I didn't see him, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't notice him when we were there. I couldn't think straight. My mind was racing, but it was as if my body was frozen in place. This couldn't be real. We had been alone most of the time on that trip, walking around, doing our own thing. Who was this man, and why was he in every single one of our photos? Why had we never seen him while we were there? I thought back to when we'd taken the photos. I tried to remember if anyone had been near us, but I couldn't remember seeing anyone else at the lighthouse, at the beach, or at any of the spots we'd taken the photos. There had been other people around, yes, but no one who stood out, no one who seemed to follow us. Not like this. I felt a deep sense of dread begin to take over me. We couldn't have imagined this. We couldn't have both missed him in every single shot, could we? I went through the rest of the photos. There was no denying it. In every single one, he was there. His presence was impossible to ignore. My girlfriend got up and started pacing. What should we do? Should we tell someone? The police? I couldn't answer. I didn't even know where to begin. How do you explain something like this? How could I tell anyone that we had a stranger following us on our vacation, showing up in every photo, yet never noticing him in real time? We decided to get out of the house. It felt like the walls were closing in on us. We grabbed our things, and for the rest of the night, we stayed out. We went to a nearby bar, trying to distract ourselves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The next morning, we checked the photos again, hoping somehow it would all make sense, or we'd see something that explained it. But the man was still there. Every single photo. We left the town early, cut the trip short. I don't know why, but I couldn't bring myself to stay any longer. I still don't know who the man was, why he kept appearing in the background of our photos, or why we never saw him while we were there. I don't know if he was following us the entire time, or if it was something more sinister. To this day, I haven't told anyone else about it. I can't explain it, and I don't want to. Every time I look at those photos, I wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed longer. It started out like any other camping trip. A group of us, me, Mark, Jenny, and Carla, decided to spend the weekend out in the woods, far from the city. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway. A break from work, from the noise, from everything. We picked a remote spot that was a couple of miles into the forest, quiet and secluded. Perfect for what we had in mind. We set up our tents in a little clearing and spent the evening around the campfire, roasting marshmallows, telling stories, and laughing. Nothing special, really. Just a group of friends enjoying the night. Eventually, we turned in, each of us heading to our respective tents. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was still dark. I couldn't sleep well. Something about the stillness of the forest unsettled me. I lay there, listening to the faint sounds of the wind rustling the trees, the occasional creak of branches swaying. I thought I heard something faintly in the distance, but I brushed it off. Probably an animal, I told myself. After a while, I managed to doze off again. The next thing I knew, I was waking up to sunlight filtering through the trees. It was quiet. Too quiet. I groggily sat up in my tent, rubbing my eyes, and then I froze. Something was off. I looked over at my backpack, which I had left right by my tent entrance the night before. It was unzipped. I stared at it for a moment, confused. I knew I had zipped it up before going to sleep. But now, it was open, the flap hanging loosely. And when I glanced down at my food bag, it was missing. All the snacks we brought, gone. I unzipped the door of my tent and stepped out. The others were already up, standing around in the clearing. Mark looked just as confused as I felt. "Did you guys touch my stuff?" I asked. He looked back at me, shaking his head. "No, but my stuff's gone too. And so's the food." "Jenny? Carla?" Jenny was crouched next to her tent, scanning the area with wide eyes. "This is weird. I didn't hear anything last night. But all my food is gone, too." Carla stood up, pointing toward the trees. "Look over there." We all followed her gaze. There, just past the edge of the clearing, were a few small, uneven prints in the dirt, heading into the woods. They looked like bare feet. Wet, dirty footprints. I don't know why, but my stomach twisted when I saw them. It didn't make sense. "Animals don't leave prints like that," Mark said, his voice tight. "No," I agreed. That's a person." The silence that followed felt heavy, like the air had thickened around us. We all stared at the tracks, unsure of what to do next. "Should we follow them?" Jenny asked, her voice trembling slightly. None of us wanted to say it out loud, but we all knew that we had to. I don't know why, but something about those footprints made my skin crawl. Maybe it was the way they led straight into the woods, as if the person had been standing there, watching us while we slept. "Yeah," Mark said, taking a deep breath. "We need to figure out who's been here." We all grabbed what we could, some water, a flashlight, and our phones, and followed the trail. The prints were faint in places, but they were easy to spot against the dirt path. We followed them in silence, the unease growing with every step. As we ventured deeper into the woods, the prints became clearer. They were fresh. The ground was soft from the rain the night before, and whoever had left them had been walking lightly. Almost too lightly. They seemed to stop and start at random, like the person was pacing, unsure of where to go next. We walked for maybe 10 minutes, following the prints as they led us further into the trees. Then, we came to a small clearing. That's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. A pile of our food. It was sitting right there in the middle of the clearing, bags of chips, granola bars, dried fruit, all scattered on the ground in a disorganized heap. But there was something else. A single shoe, tossed carelessly aside, as if the person had just dropped it there. Who would do this?" Carla whispered, stepping forward. She reached down and grabbed a granola bar, holding it in her hand like it was some sort of evidence. I didn't know how to answer. The more I looked at the food, the more wrong it felt. Why would someone take all of our food, eat some of it, and leave the rest here? Why would they leave a shoe behind? Mark bent down to pick up the shoe, holding it up to inspect it. It was an old, worn sneaker, the kind you wouldn't think twice about. But there was a faint smell to it, like dirt and sweat mixed together. "Maybe it was just some guy who got lost or something," Jenny suggested, her voice unsure. "Maybe he was hungry." I didn't know what to think, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't some random encounter. Whoever had been here had been watching us. I felt it in my gut. We looked around, but there was nothing else to find. No sign of the person, no other clues, just the footprints that seemed to fade the deeper we went into the woods. We decided to head back to the campsite. Whatever had happened, I didn't want to be out here any longer. When we got back, we immediately started packing up. None of us wanted to stay in that spot for even another minute. We moved as quickly as we could, each of us too on edge to speak. As we were finishing up, Mark suddenly stopped, his eyes scanning the tree line. "You guys, do you hear that?" We all stopped and listened. At first, I didn't hear anything. But then I did. A faint rustling, like something or someone was moving between the trees. It was too soft to be an animal. It wasn't the wind either. I don't know how, but we all knew at that moment that we weren't alone. Without saying another word, we grabbed our things and ran. We didn't look back. We just ran, keeping our heads down and our eyes forward. The feeling that we were being followed stayed with us, creeping up our spines, making us move faster. The sound of the rustling was still there, too faint to be sure of, but close enough to make our hearts race. We didn't stop until we reached the car. We didn't talk about it much on the drive back. I think none of us wanted to. But none of us forgot. The bare footprints. The missing food. The strange feeling that we weren't supposed to be there. I never went back to that place. None of us did. And I haven't been camping since. I've never been one to get too worked up over small things. I'm the type to shrug off weird noises or strange coincidences. So, when I rented this cute little Airbnb for a weekend getaway, I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. I was just looking for some peace and quiet, a chance to unwind. The place looked charming, a little cottage with a rustic feel, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. Perfect for a short break. I arrived late on a Friday evening, and the host was nice enough to leave a key for me in the lockbox. It was a little colder than I expected, so I was thankful to find the place warm and cozy when I stepped inside. The living room had a fireplace, a couple of comfy chairs, and some soft lighting. Honestly, it was like stepping into a little retreat. I could already feel the tension from work and life melting away. The bathroom was small but functional, and the bed was comfy. Nothing too fancy, but it had that homey charm. I went ahead and unpacked, made myself a cup of tea, and spent the evening reading a book by the fire. Nothing out of the ordinary happened the first night, and I had a peaceful sleep. But then came the second night. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was definitely still dark. I was half awake, lying in bed, when I heard something. At first, I thought it was just the owls settling. It's an old place, after all. But the sound was strange. It was like a scratching noise, coming from somewhere within the walls. It wasn't loud, just enough to make me stop and listen. I turned my head, staring at the wall behind my bed. It wasn't the first time I heard something like that in an older house, so I tried to ignore it. It's probably just a mouse, I thought. Or maybe some pipes creaking. I mean, this wasn't a mansion, it was an old cottage, and old cottages had all kinds of quirks. I managed to fall back asleep, pushing the noise out of my mind. But the next night, it happened again. The scratching. It was softer this time, but still there. It seemed to come from behind the wall in the bathroom, right behind the mirror. At first, I told myself it was just the owls settling. I even checked the bathroom, looking around to see if maybe it was something obvious, like a loose pipe or a rodent hiding behind the walls. But everything seemed fine. After a couple more nights of the same thing, I started feeling a little uneasy. I kept hearing that same scratching noise, and it was always coming from behind the bathroom mirror. It wasn't constant, just faint enough to make me question whether I was imagining it. But I knew I wasn't. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but something about it just didn't sit right. On the fifth night, the scratching was louder than before. It woke me up in the middle of the night, making my heart race. It felt so close. I lay there, staring at the bathroom door, trying to convince myself it was nothing. It's just an old house, I repeated in my mind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I needed to check it out. I got up, the cold floor sending a shiver up my spine. My hands were shaking as I walked to the bathroom, feeling like I had to know what was behind that mirror. I flipped the light switch and stood in front of it, staring at my own reflection. I examined the mirror closely, looking for any sign that it was loose or damaged in some way. The mirror looked normal, but something about the sound coming from behind it just didn't sit right. I don't know what possessed me, but I decided to investigate. I ran my fingers along the edges of the mirror, gently trying to shift it. To my surprise, it budged slightly. The frame was loose. I pulled harder, and the mirror came away from the wall, revealing a small gap behind it. There, hidden behind the mirror, was a crawl space. My stomach dropped. It was dark inside the crawl space, but I could see enough to make out a few details. It wasn't big, just large enough for someone to crawl through. The walls were covered in dust, and there were old, broken wooden beams that looked like they'd been there for decades. I couldn't believe it. How could something like this be hidden behind a mirror in a rented place? I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I felt an overwhelming urge to peer into the space. I grabbed my phone and used the flashlight feature to get a better look. There was nothing obviously dangerous in there, just some old cobwebs, a few random objects like discarded papers and a rusted tin can, but then something caught my eye. A small, crumpled piece of paper was lying against the far wall. I reached in and pulled it out carefully. It was a handwritten note, but it was old, the ink faded and smeared in places. My heart skipped a beat when I read it. I know you're here. You can't hide from me. I froze. My blood ran cold. What did that mean? Who had written this? And why was it hidden behind the mirror in this Airbnb? I stood there for a moment, my mind racing. Should I call the host? Should I leave right now? My hands were shaking as I stood there, staring at the paper, my mind running through every possible explanation. Maybe it was just some weird prank. Maybe the house had been rented before, and the previous guests had left it there for some strange reason. But something about the note didn't feel right. It felt like a warning. Like someone had been here before me. Someone who knew I was here. I put the paper back in the crawl space, not wanting to touch it any longer. I shoved the mirror back into place, trying to steady my breathing. The scratching noise had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That someone had been watching me the whole time I was in this place. I decided then and there that I needed to leave. I packed up my things quickly, not even bothering to finish my coffee or clean up. I wasn't going to stick around to find out who or what was behind that mirror. I called the host and told them what I had found. They seemed confused, claiming they had no idea about any crawl space or hidden spaces in the house. They apologized, but I didn't feel comforted. After I hung up, I locked the door behind me and left as fast as I could. I didn't go back to the cottage to check the mirror, and I never spoke to the host again. I stayed in a hotel that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in that space before me. Watching. Waiting. It was late when I got home. Too late, really. I'd been working all day, then had to go to the grocery store, so by the time I pulled into the garage, I was beyond tired. All I wanted was to get inside, kick off my shoes, and get some sleep. The garage door closed behind me with a soft rumble, and I got out of my car, reaching for the key to the door that led into the house. That's when I noticed the footprints. There was nothing unusual at first. The floor of the garage was dusty, as it always was. I didn't mind, it wasn't anything I hadn't seen 100 times before. But as I took a few steps toward the door, I saw it. A set of prints in the dust, fresh ones, leading into the dark corner of the garage. They were just there, like someone had walked in after me. I froze. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I tracked them in myself somehow, though I couldn't remember walking across the garage when I pulled in. My car had been parked with the door closed. But then I looked more closely. These prints didn't look like mine. They were heavier, deeper in the dust. They weren't there before, I was sure of it. They led into the far corner, where the old shelves full of tools and boxes were stored. The space was dark, a place I hadn't paid much attention to in months. But now it felt like that dark corner had its own presence. I felt a cold rush through me, a tight knot in my chest. The thought of someone being in the garage while I wasn't home, hiding there, was almost too much to take. But what if it was just a mistake? What if it was nothing? I tried to convince myself, but my gut told me it wasn't right. I didn't want to check. I wanted to forget about it, lock the door, and go upstairs to bed. But my feet were already moving before I could stop myself. Every instinct screamed at me to be cautious, to think it through. What if someone was still in the house? I turned the light on by the door, but it didn't do much to brighten the corner. The shadows were thick, clinging to the corners of the garage. My heart was beating faster now. Every time I thought about walking over there, I kept thinking about how easy it would be for someone to hide. I stepped closer, the floor creaking under my weight. The prints led to a spot between the shelves and the wall, where the light barely reached. It was the perfect hiding place. My breath felt shallow as I stared at the prints. I knew I should call someone, should have called the police before even thinking about getting closer. But some strange need to know, kept me from doing that. When I reached the corner, I stopped. I couldn't just go around poking into places like this without thinking it through. I had been living here for years, alone, and the last thing I wanted was to get myself into a situation that could have been easily avoided. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. I moved the shelves just enough to peer behind them. The moment my eyes caught what was there, my heart dropped. There was nothing but shadows and dust. The shelves were filled with boxes and old tools, just as I had left them. But something didn't sit right. I scanned the space quickly again, and that's when I saw it, something out of place. A single chair, old and battered, was tucked behind the shelves. I never used that chair, never kept it there. It wasn't mine. The dust around it was disturbed, the floor scraped in a way that suggested it had been moved recently. I felt my stomach lurch. Someone had been here. Someone had moved the chair and left the footprints. My mind was racing, all the possibilities flooding me at once. What if they were still here? What if they were hiding just out of sight, waiting for me to walk right into their trap? I could hear my own breath in my ears as I backed away from the corner, keeping my eyes on the chair, on the shadows, half expecting someone to jump out at me. But nothing moved. Everything was still. Too still. I don't know why, but I didn't turn off the light. I walked back to the door, my hands shaking. I had to get out of that garage. I had to make sure the house was locked up tight. As I stepped back inside, I double-checked the locks, double-checked the windows. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. I called a friend, told them I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't sleep. I couldn't shake the images in my mind, the chair, the prints, the darkness in that corner. I stayed up the rest of the night, just pacing, waiting for the sun to come up. The next day, I called a friend again, asking if they could come by to check things out. They laughed it off, saying I was probably just overreacting. But when they came over and saw the prints, they didn't laugh anymore. We went over to the corner, looking at the chair, the dust, and everything that had been left behind. We moved the shelves and found something else, something I hadn't noticed before. A small pile of items had been carefully tucked behind the shelf: a bottle of water, some empty wrappers, a pair of old sneakers. The thing that chilled me the most wasn't the footprints or the chair or anything we found. It was the realization that someone had been living in my garage, and I had never even noticed. I still don't know who it was, or how long they'd been there. I don't know why they were in my house. But that night changed everything for me. I haven't felt safe at home since, and I can't get the image of those prints out of my mind. I moved a few weeks later. I don't want to know what would have happened if I hadn't gone into the garage that night. I don't want to think about what might have happened if I had waited another day. I don't know what time it was when I first heard the sound. It was quiet at first, like a light tapping, almost like someone was gently knocking on my window. It wasn't enough to wake me up completely, but it was enough to pull me out of my sleep for a second. I thought maybe it was a tree branch, or the wind, something harmless. It had rained the night before, and I'd noticed the trees outside were moving a little more than usual, so I just brushed it off. But then it kept going. Tap. 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 Slowly, methodically, like whoever was making the sound was trying to get my attention. I turned over in bed, trying to ignore it, but I couldn't. My mind started to drift, wondering what it could be. I glanced at the window, but I couldn't make anything out. It was dark, and the curtains were drawn. I decided to let it go, hoping I would fall back asleep. I didn't. I must have drifted in and out of sleep a few more times, but the tapping kept coming back, quieter but still persistent. It wasn't the wind, not anymore. I knew that for sure. Something about it didn't feel right. The sound was too deliberate, too constant. I even got up once, pulled back the curtain a little to see if there was anything outside, but I didn't see anything. I stood there for a few seconds, waiting for another tap. Nothing. So I went back to bed, tried to calm myself, and closed my eyes. When I woke up the next morning, the tapping had stopped. The house was still. The sunlight was coming through the window, and everything felt normal again, but there was this nagging feeling in the back of my mind, something telling me to check. I dragged myself out of bed, still feeling half asleep. My mind was foggy, and I wasn't sure if I was just overthinking the whole thing. I walked over to the window and pulled the curtain back to look outside. Everything seemed normal. The trees were swaying gently in the breeze. The yard was quiet. But then my eyes shifted down to the glass. I don't know how long I stared at it, but when I finally focused, my blood ran cold. There were handprints on the window. I don't know what I thought at first. Maybe I was still half dreaming. Maybe my brain was playing tricks on me. But there they were, clear as day, 5 long fingers pressed against the glass. The prints were smudged, like someone had pressed their hand against it from the outside and dragged it across. I backed away from the window like something might reach through and grab me. I couldn't move for a moment. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. How did this happen? I was sure I had closed the curtains before going to bed. No one could have been outside. The windows were locked. I thought about calling someone, asking if they'd been messing with me, but I knew in my gut that wasn't the case. I stepped closer to the window again, my hand shaking as I reached out to touch the glass. The prints were cold, almost damp. like someone had touched them only a short time ago. My heart was pounding in my chest as I searched the yard again, looking for any sign of who could have left those marks. But there was nothing. No one. Just an empty yard, the trees swaying in the wind. I stood there, staring at the handprints, and then the thought hit me hard. What if someone had been there last night? What if someone had been standing right outside my window, tapping and waiting for me to notice them? I felt a wave of panic wash over me. The thought of someone so close, someone standing right outside, watching me while I slept, made my stomach turn. The tapping had felt like it was coming from inside my mind, but now I realized it had been real. Someone had been there, and they had been close enough to leave their marks. I didn't know what to do. My first thought was to call the police, but then I wondered if they would take it seriously. I mean, it wasn't like I had any proof. There were no cameras around, no footprints outside the window. Just the handprints on the glass. No one else had been with me the night before. I had been alone. I spent the next few hours pacing around the house, checking the locks, the windows, the doors. I even went outside and walked around the yard, half expecting to find someone hiding nearby, but there was nothing. The grass was undisturbed, and the air was eerily calm. It wasn't until later that afternoon, when I went to check the window again, that I saw something else. The handprints were still there, but they were smeared. Like someone had tried to rub them off, but didn't quite manage. That was when I realized something else. There were more prints. The handprints were just the beginning. There were small, almost invisible finger marks, ones that ran along the edges of the window frame. Whoever had been there had been careful, moving slowly, quietly. I don't know how to explain it, but I felt like I was being watched. Every time I moved around the house, I had the sensation that someone was right outside, waiting. It felt like I couldn't get away from it. I was being followed, or stalked, or worse, just observed from a distance. I didn't want to stay in that house after that. I couldn't. I packed a bag, grabbed my phone, and went to stay with a friend for a while. I told them what happened, but they didn't seem to understand the way I felt. They thought I was just paranoid, and maybe I was. But when I thought about the tapping, the handprints, the feeling of being watched, I couldn't shake it. It was real, and it wasn't something I was going to forget anytime soon. The thing that still gets to me is how close they were. Whoever it was, they were right outside my window. They were so close I could have heard them breathing if I'd woken up at the right time. But I didn't. I never heard anything. I still don't know who was there, or why they were watching me. Maybe I'll never know. I don't live in that house anymore. I moved out a few weeks later. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed in a new place, I still hear the tapping sound. Every now and then, I think I see handprints on the windows. But when I go to check, they're gone. I can't help but wonder if they're still out there, watching, waiting. It started like any other evening. I had just finished a long shift at work, and all I wanted was to get home, unwind, and forget about the day. The drive wasn't anything special, just the usual route I always took, nothing too long or complicated. I remember the road being a bit darker than usual, since it had been raining earlier, but the highway was clear. I was almost out of the city, just a few miles from home when it happened. I was cruising along in the right lane, just minding my own business, when I saw the headlights of a truck in my rearview mirror. It wasn't unusual to see big rigs at that time of day, but this one was tailing me way too closely. I figured the driver must have been in a hurry or something, so I switched to the left lane to let them pass. But instead of passing, the truck just stayed there. I tried to shake it off and focus back on the road, but the truck wasn't backing off. Suddenly, it swerved toward me. I don't know if it was the rain or if the driver just wasn't paying attention, but the next thing I knew, I had to jerk the wheel hard to avoid being sideswiped. My heart slammed in my chest as I veered to the shoulder of the road, barely missing the truck by inches. I could feel my hands shaking on the wheel. I don't even know how I managed to get the car back under control. I just kept driving, my mind racing. It wasn't until I looked in my rear view again that I saw the truck pull back into its lane. It hadn't stopped. It didn't even slow down. It just went on like nothing had happened. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It felt like my body was still stuck in the moment of almost colliding. I kept checking the rear view, but the truck had disappeared. I kept my speed steady the rest of the way home, making sure I didn't look like I was being followed. The next morning, I didn't think much of it. I figured the whole thing was just a weird, close-call accident. I told myself it was over. But then things started to get odd. The truck appeared again. I was getting out of my car at work when I saw it parked across the street. I didn't recognize the driver, but I recognized the truck, big, rusty, with a faded logo on the side. It wasn't the same truck I had almost collided with the night before, but it looked so close that it made my stomach tighten. My breath hitched. I tried to shake it off as just coincidence. There are tons of trucks that look the same, right? It didn't make sense to overthink it. But as I walked into the building, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting the truck to start moving. It didn't. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The day dragged on. I tried to focus, but I kept thinking about the truck. It was almost like my mind wouldn't let it go. The whole time I was in the office, I couldn't stop checking the windows, expecting to see it parked out there again. When I left for lunch, the truck was gone. I took a deep breath, thinking maybe it really was just a coincidence after all. That night, I got home late again. The rain had come back, and the road was slick. I pulled into my driveway, and then I froze. The truck. It was parked at the end of my street, right where the road meets the main highway. I could barely make out the shape through the rain, but there was no mistaking it. It was the same truck. Same faded logo. Same rust spots. The truck that had nearly sideswiped me the night before. I didn't even want to think about it. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was just a truck that happened to be in my neighborhood. But deep down, I knew. This was too much of a coincidence. I stayed inside that night, didn't even go out for a walk. I kept my blinds closed and didn't leave until the next morning. The next few days were the same. Every time I went out, I saw the truck always parked somewhere near where I was, always staying just far enough away to not seem suspicious, but close enough to make me uncomfortable. One morning, it was parked outside my workplace again. Another day, I saw it at a gas station when I stopped to fill up. The worst part was that I never saw the driver. Just the truck. Every time I tried to look for the person inside, there was nothing. The windows were too tinted, and the truck was always empty when I glanced in. But it was always there. I started making different routes to work, hoping to avoid it, but it didn't matter. Every time I turned a corner or stopped somewhere, the truck would appear. It was as if someone was tracking me, keeping tabs on my every move. I couldn't get away from it. I started feeling paranoid. I'd get into my car and check the rearview mirror, expecting to see the truck right behind me. Sometimes I'd drive in circles, just to make sure I wasn't being followed. I couldn't take it anymore. I tried talking to the police, but they said it wasn't enough to report. It wasn't like the truck was doing anything wrong. I was just seeing things. That's what they told me. Then, one evening, I finally snapped. I couldn't keep living like this, constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if the truck would be there, lurking. So, I did something that felt insane but also necessary. I drove to the truck's location. I found it parked near a convenience store on the edge of town. I parked across the street, out of sight. And I waited. For hours, nothing happened. It just sat there, like it was waiting for me. But eventually, around midnight, a figure stepped out of the convenience store, carrying a bag of snacks. It wasn't the driver I'd seen before, but there was something about him that made my heart drop. He had that same look, like he'd been watching me for days. Maybe he was the driver. Maybe he wasn't. I couldn't tell. But as he got closer to the truck, I saw something else. Another man. A second person hidden in the shadows, watching me. I didn't wait around to find out what happened next. I turned my car around and sped home, not even caring about the lights or the speed. I got inside and locked the door behind me, my heart pounding. The truck never showed up after that night. I don't know if it was a coincidence or if they finally got tired of watching me, but I never saw it again. It was over. But I still think about it. I don't know who those people were or why they were following me, but I hope I never find out. I wasn't sure what I was expecting when I checked into the hotel. It was a last-minute booking after a long day of travel, and honestly, I was just looking forward to getting some sleep. I'd been on the road for nearly 12 hours and my body was aching. So when I arrived at the hotel, I didn't really pay much attention to the details. I grabbed my room key and made my way up to the third floor, expecting to just crash and forget about the world for a few hours. The room was pretty standard for a mid-range hotel, nothing fancy, but it had everything I needed. A bed, a small desk, a TV that I wasn't going to use, and a bathroom that was far too small for my liking. But at that point, I didn't care. I was just glad to have a roof over my head for the night. I locked the door behind me, unpacked a few things, and threw myself on the bed. The hotel was quiet. Too quiet, if I'm being honest, but I didn't think much of it. It was late, and I figured most of the other guests were already asleep. I set my alarm for an early start the next day, and I pulled the covers up, sinking into the warmth of the bed. It didn't take long for me to fall asleep. I was exhausted, and the comfort of the hotel bed quickly lulled me into a deep, dreamless slumber. The first thing that woke me up was the sound of my door unlocking. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I blinked a few times, trying to shake off the remnants of sleep. But then, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of a key turning in the lock, followed by a soft click. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't expecting anyone. I hadn't ordered room service, and I hadn't told anyone I was in town, so why would someone be unlocking my door at this hour? I listened, straining to hear any sounds, but everything was eerily quiet. I told myself it was probably just the hotel staff. Maybe they were checking something, doing a routine check, or maybe it was a mistake. They could have been given the wrong room key by mistake. But that didn't explain why the door opened. I was too scared to move, but my curiosity pushed me to inch closer to the door. I could hear soft footsteps, almost hesitant. The door cracked open just a little more, and I could see the shadow of someone standing in the hallway. Then the door opened all the way. A man stood there, staring at me with wide eyes. He looked disoriented, like he'd just woken up himself. He was holding a room key, and he looked down at it, then back at me. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice shaky. "I think there's been a mistake." I was given this room key at the front desk. I'm supposed to be in here. I sat up in bed, blinking in disbelief. What? The man took a step into the room. His clothes were disheveled, as though he'd been traveling or just got out of bed. His hair was messy, and he had that look on his face, the one people get when they don't quite know what's going on. I could see him glancing around the room, clearly confused. "I'm really sorry," he repeated. "They must have given me the wrong key." I stared at him, still trying to process what was happening. My first instinct was to get up, but I didn't. I couldn't. Something about the way he stood there, looking like he didn't belong, made me feel like I was the one who didn't belong in the room. I should have said something, called the front desk, but the words didn't come out. "You're sure you're in the right room?" I asked, trying to make sense of it. Maybe he'd gotten confused. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe he just made a mistake. But even as I asked, I knew something was wrong. I could feel it in my gut. "I don't know," he said, fidgeting with the key in his hand. He looked over at me again, his face a mix of confusion and embarrassment. "They told me this was where I was supposed to be." There was an odd hesitation in his voice, something off. And yet, there was this genuine, almost apologetic tone in the way he spoke. Something felt wrong. I quickly glanced at the door, then back at the man. It all felt surreal. Why would he walk into a room at this hour, acting so casual about it? Why didn't he immediately apologize and leave when he realized his mistake? "Okay, I think you need to go back downstairs," I said, my voice trembling slightly. I'm not sure what happened, but... Before I could finish, the man stepped further into the room, his presence blocking the doorway. He didn't push past me, but he didn't move either. He stood there, still holding the key, staring at me as if he was processing something. The more I looked at him, the more I realized how out of place he seemed. I tried to stand up, but something stopped me. The room felt smaller now, almost like the walls were closing in. There was this feeling in the pit of my stomach, a sense of unease that kept growing. My hand reached for my phone on the bedside table, but I was too slow. "I'm really sorry," the man said again, his eyes never leaving mine. "I didn't mean to intrude. But this is my room, right?" I swallowed hard. My heart was racing, and I could feel my palms starting to sweat. Something about the way he asked that question, it was like he didn't even care whether he was supposed to be there or not. I finally found my voice. "No, it's not. I've been here all night. I'm the one staying here." I reached for my phone again, this time with more urgency. But the man took a step forward, and I froze. "No, it's fine," he said quickly, his tone suddenly shifting. There was a forced calmness to his voice now, almost too calm. "It's just a mistake. I'll go down and get it sorted out. I'm really sorry." But he didn't move. For a few seconds, we just stood there, eye to eye, in that silent space between us. My mind was spinning, and I couldn't make sense of what was happening. It didn't feel like an accident anymore. It felt deliberate. "All right," I said, slowly, my voice shaky. "I'm calling the front desk now." I held my phone up, but the man suddenly snapped out of his daze and backed away from me. His expression shifted again, his eyes darting around the room as if realizing how far he'd crossed the line. "Yeah, of course," he mumbled, his voice quiet, almost as if he wasn't sure of himself anymore. I'll go get this fixed." And just like that, he turned, walking out of the room, his footsteps fading down the hallway. I waited a few moments, my heart still racing, before I picked up the phone and dialed the front desk. The person on the other end answered quickly, sounding cheerful. "Front desk, how can I help you?" "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's been a mistake. Someone just walked into my room with a key. They said it was the same key I was given, but there's no way that's possible. Can you double-check the room assignments for me?" There was a brief pause. "Of course," the clerk replied, her voice suddenly more businesslike. "Give me one moment." She came back to the phone, her tone much more serious now. "I'm sorry, but according to our system, there's no record of anyone being assigned that room key tonight. Are you sure the person you spoke to was from the hotel?" I didn't have the words to explain what I was feeling. The man had seemed so convincing, so sure of himself. But now, after hearing that, the whole situation felt even stranger. Why had he been so confident that he belonged there? Why didn't he leave when I asked him to? I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't been awake. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't been alert enough to hear the door unlock. But I do know one thing now: I'll never look at hotels the same way again. Every time I close my hotel room door, I wonder who else might be on the other side. I didn't think much of it the first time. It was late, probably close to midnight, when I got off my shift at the diner. The parking lot was mostly empty, just my car and a few others belonging to the night crew from the nearby gas station. I was tired, my feet aching from running orders back and forth all night, and I wasn't paying attention as I unlocked my car. That's when I noticed it. A folded piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. I assumed it was an advertisement, maybe a coupon for an oil change or some other random thing. But when I pulled it out, I realized it wasn't that at all. It was a handwritten note. The paper was thin and crinkled, like it had been folded and unfolded a few times. The handwriting was neat, almost too perfect, like someone had taken their time with every letter. "Good job tonight, my name. You looked beautiful. Can't wait to see you again." I froze. My name. It was right there, clear as day. I looked around the parking lot, half expecting to see someone watching me, but it was empty. Just the dim glow of the streetlights and the hum of the gas station sign flickering in the distance. I shoved the note into my bag and got into my car, locking the doors as soon as I was inside. I told myself it was probably just a prank. Maybe one of the guys from the kitchen thought it would be funny to mess with me. But when I asked the next day, no one admitted to it. They all laughed it off, said it was probably one of our regulars trying to flirt. I wanted to believe that. The second note showed up 3 days later. It was the same kind of paper, folded neatly under my windshield wiper. This one was longer, though, and the tone felt off. "You're so kind to everyone. You're different from the others. They don't appreciate you like I do. I see you. I know how hard you work." Again, it was signed with my name, and the handwriting was the same, deliberate and careful, almost like a child's penmanship. This time, I didn't tell anyone. I threw the note away as soon as I got home, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Whoever was leaving these notes knew my name. They knew when I worked. The third note came a week later, and this one scared me. "Why didn't you smile at me today? Did I do something wrong? You don't have to be afraid of me, my name. I just want to talk to you." By then, I was on edge. I started parking in different spots every shift, as close to the entrance as possible. I made sure to leave with other coworkers whenever I could, but sometimes that wasn't an option. Sometimes I had to walk to my car alone. I started checking my windshield before I even got close to my car. Most nights, there was nothing there. But then another note would appear, and every time, it got more personal. "You look tired tonight. Are you sleeping enough? I worry about you. Your hair looks better when it's down. You shouldn't tie it up so much. I saw you talking to that guy. Do you like him? He's not right for you. That one made me feel sick. I couldn't remember who I had talked to that night, but the idea of someone watching me, analyzing every interaction, was enough to make my skin crawl. I started carrying pepper spray. I even went to the police, but they didn't take me seriously. They told me it was probably just a harmless admirer and that unless the person made a direct threat, there wasn't much they could do. By the time the sixth note appeared, I was barely sleeping. I'd see shadows moving outside my apartment windows and jump at every noise. This note was different. It wasn't tucked under my windshield wiper. Instead, it was taped to my car door, right next to the handle. Why are you ignoring me? I thought we had something special. You're hurting my feelings. I don't want to have to do something drastic. That word drastic made my stomach drop. I called out of work the next day. I told my manager everything, and to her credit, she took it seriously. She said she'd make sure someone walked me to my car from now on, and she offered to switch up my shifts to make my schedule less predictable. For a few days, things were quiet. No new notes, no strange shadows, no reason to panic. Then, one night, as I was leaving the diner with Jake, one of the line cooks, I saw him. He was standing across the street, partially hidden by a tree. He wasn't looking directly at me, but I could tell he was watching. He was wearing a dark hoodie, the hood pulled up over his head, and his hands were shoved into his pockets. Do you see that guy? I whispered to Jake, nodding in the man's direction. Jake squinted, then nodded. Yeah. Creepy. Want me to go say something? I shook my head. No. Let's just go. We walked to my car together, and I made sure to lock the doors as soon as I was inside. As I drove away, I checked my rearview mirror. The man was still standing there, watching. That was the last time I saw him. The note stopped after that night, and eventually, I stopped looking over my shoulder. But every now and then, when I'm walking to my car in the dark or working a late shift, I feel that same prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone's watching me. And I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for the right moment to leave another note. It started out small, something I almost didn't notice at first. After my evening workouts at the gym, I'd see the same men hanging around the parking lot. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. The gym wasn't in the best part of town, but it wasn't the worst either. There were a few businesses nearby, and I assumed he was waiting for someone. He wasn't particularly striking, medium build, plain clothes, dark hair. The kind of person you wouldn't give a second glance to. The first couple of times, he was just there, leaning against a car or standing near the streetlight, looking at his phone. I didn't think much of it. But then I realized he was always there. It didn't matter what time I finished my workout, early evening, late at night, even on weekends, he was in the lot. He never came into the gym, never seemed to interact with anyone. Just stood there, always in the same general area. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe he lived nearby, or maybe his car was broken down and he was waiting for help. But as the weeks went by, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. One night, after a particularly late session, I came out of the gym to find the lot mostly empty. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, flickering glow. He was there again, standing near the same spot, just a little too close to my car. I hesitated, lingering near the gym entrance. My keys were in my hand, gripped tightly, the small canister of pepper spray dangling from the ring. He wasn't looking at his phone this time. He was watching me. I took a deep breath and started walking. The sound of my footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet lot. I avoided eye contact, keeping my head down, but I could feel his gaze. As I got closer to my car, he moved. "Excuse me," he said, stepping forward. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to keep calm. "Can I help you?" He smiled, a strange, tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I've seen you around here. Just wanted to say hi." I stopped a few feet from my car, keeping the vehicle between us. "Okay. Hi." His smile didn't waver. "You're here a lot. You must be really dedicated." I didn't know what to say to that. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how to end the conversation without escalating it. "I guess," I said, glancing toward the gym. The front desk was empty. The girl who usually worked nights must have stepped out. "You don't have to be nervous," he said, taking a step closer. I tightened my grip on my keys, the pepper spray pressing into my palm. "I'm not nervous." He laughed, a low, uncomfortable sound. "I just thought maybe we could talk. You know, get to know each other. You're always in such a rush." "I need to go," I said firmly, taking a step toward my car door. He moved again, positioning himself closer, cutting off my path. "Just a few minutes." "What's the harm?" The smile was still there, but there was something in his eyes now, something sharp, predatory. I didn't answer. Instead, I unlocked my car with the fob and opened the door just enough to wedge myself between it and the frame. His expression changed, the smile slipping for a fraction of a second. "Hey, I'm just being friendly. No need to be rude." I slid into the driver's seat, locking the doors before he could say anything else. He stayed there, standing just outside my window, his face unreadable. For a moment, I thought he was going to walk away. But then he leaned down, his hands on the edge of the window. "You don't have to be like that," he said, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. I started the engine, the sound cutting through the silence. His eyes didn't move from mine. As I pulled out of the parking spot, he stepped back, his hands falling to his sides. I drove out of the lot as quickly as I could, my hands trembling on the wheel. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing there, watching me go. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I called the gym and reported what happened. The manager assured me they'd look into it, maybe even review the security footage, but I didn't feel reassured. For the next week, I changed my routine, going to the gym at different times. But every time, I found myself scanning the parking lot, my stomach twisting into knots when I didn't see him and twisting even tighter when I did. It wasn't until a Friday night that things escalated. I had just finished my workout and was heading to my car when I noticed him again. This time, he wasn't standing near the lot. He was sitting in a car, parked a few spaces away from mine. As I walked past, the engine started. I didn't look at him, didn't slow down. My heart was racing, every nerve on edge. I got into my car and locked the doors, my fingers fumbling with the keys as I started the engine. The headlights of his car turned on. I pulled out of the lot, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. He followed. At first, I told myself it was another coincidence. But as I made turn after turn, he stayed behind me, always at a distance but never too far. I drove aimlessly, trying to lose him, but no matter where I went, he was there. Finally, I spotted a gas station up ahead, brightly lit with a few cars in the lot. I pulled in, parking as close to the entrance as I could. He drove past, his car slowing just enough for me to catch a glimpse of his face. I stayed in the station for almost half an hour, pretending to browse the shelves. When I finally got back to my car, he was gone. That was the last time I saw him, but it hasn't stopped me from looking over my shoulder, from checking the parking lot every time I leave the gym. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I know I'll never forget the look in his eyes. It happened a few months ago, but I still can't shake the feeling of what happened that night. I've told a few people about it, but I don't think anyone really gets how scary it was. I still don't fully understand how I ended up in that situation. It all started when I finished my work late one evening. I'm in marketing, and sometimes I'm stuck in the office for hours after everyone else leaves. It was around 11 p.m., and I just wanted to get home. Normally, I take the subway, but it was a Friday, and the trains always feel a little sketchy that late, so I decided to order a rideshare instead. I opened the app, booked a ride, and went outside to wait. I stood by the curb, scrolling through my phone, not really paying much attention to what was going on around me. I was tired and ready to get home. A few minutes later, I saw the car pull up. The app said the name and the car model, so I walked over to it and opened the door without thinking much about it. The driver, a man, looked a little older than me, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s. He didn't seem unusual. He smiled at me when I got in, which I returned with a tired nod. He didn't say anything at first, so I just buckled my seatbelt and settled in, expecting to hear the usual small talk. But instead, he started driving without asking for confirmation or anything. It wasn't until we had driven for a few minutes that I noticed something was off. The route didn't feel familiar. I live in a part of the city that's pretty straightforward to get to from downtown, but we seemed to be heading in the opposite direction. I thought maybe he was taking an alternate route or something, but the streets were getting emptier and less familiar. At first, I didn't say anything. I figured maybe I had just misjudged the route in my tired state. But after about 10 minutes of driving down roads I didn't recognize, I started to get anxious. "Excuse me," I said, my voice a little shaky. "This isn't the way to my place." The driver didn't respond at first, just kept his hands on the wheel, his eyes on the road. I tried again. "Hey, I think you missed my turn. Can you turn around?" That's when he finally spoke. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "No, we're going the right way." I could hear a slight accent in his voice, but it was hard to place. His eyes stayed locked on the road. I felt a knot in my stomach, but I tried to reason with myself. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe he wasn't paying attention. Still, something about the way he said it didn't sit right with me. "Listen, I'm not sure where we're going, but I need to get home," I said, trying to keep my tone polite but firm. "Could you please turn around?" He glanced at me quickly, just a quick flick of his eyes, before looking back at the road. "You don't need to worry about it. I'll take care of it." I couldn't make sense of what was happening. At this point, I started to feel a little panicked. My phone was on the passenger seat beside me, and I considered texting a friend or calling someone. But something in my gut told me not to. I didn't want to give him any reason to get more defensive or angry. We kept driving for what felt like an eternity, passing familiar streetlights that grew more sparse the farther we went. The streets turned darker, and the buildings started to look less like the city and more like empty industrial areas. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is getting too far out. I need to go home." The driver didn't answer right away. The silence felt suffocating. I thought maybe he hadn't heard me, but then he said something so quiet, I almost didn't catch it. "You'll be fine. Just relax." That's when I started to really panic. The rational part of me wanted to get out, but I didn't know where we were, and I had no idea if I'd even be able to get another ride back. There was nothing around us but dark roads. I tried the door handle, but it was locked. I pulled harder, but it wouldn't budge. "Please let me out," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, even though my heart was racing. "I need to get out of the car now." The driver's grip on the wheel tightened. He didn't look at me, but I could tell he was aware of what I had said. He didn't speak for a long time, and I started to feel like I was suffocating in the small space. "Don't make this difficult," he finally said, his voice colder now. It was like a switch had flipped. "You'll get out when I say so." I couldn't believe it. This wasn't happening. I was in a car with a stranger, headed somewhere I didn't know, with no way to get out. The panic hit me hard, and I started to think about what my options were. I could try to jump out when we stopped, but what if we were somewhere with no one around? What if he came after me? I wasn't strong enough to fight him off. The car slowed down, and I immediately braced myself. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I didn't know if he was going to stop and let me go or if he was going to hurt me. "Stop the car," I demanded, my voice trembling. "Let me out right now." He glanced over at me again, but his expression hadn't changed. It was like he was enjoying my fear. "We're almost there," he said, as if I should just trust him. That's when I couldn't take it anymore. I reached for my phone and started tapping furiously. I knew I had to make a call, even if it was just to alert someone to what was happening. I dialed 911, trying to keep my hands steady as the car turned onto an even darker road. Before I could say anything to the dispatcher, the driver jerked the wheel, making the car swerve slightly. He looked at me then, finally meeting my eyes with a menacing glare. "Hang up," he ordered. "Now." I didn't even think. I hit the red button to end the call. My heart was thundering in my chest. I had no idea if I had just made things worse or saved myself. I took a deep breath and tried to gather myself. I needed to act quickly. "Listen," I said, my voice much more firm now. "I'm going to call the police. You can't do this." He didn't say anything for a moment, then nodded. It was almost like he had made up his mind about something. Finally, he slowed the car and pulled over to the side of the road. "Get out," he said flatly. I didn't ask questions. I opened the door, ran out of the car, and didn't stop until I was far enough away that I could barely see the car's headlights in the distance. My legs felt like jelly, and I was breathing so fast I thought I might pass out. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't gotten out when I did. I don't know if I'd be here writing this. But I never took a rideshare again after that night, and I don't plan to anytime soon. It started as a normal hike, at least that's what I kept telling myself. I've always loved the outdoors, and this trail was a popular one. I'd heard good things about it, and a few friends had hiked it before. So, when I was able to get a group together, I thought it would be the perfect weekend getaway. There were 4 of us, me, Sarah, Max, and Charlie. We were all seasoned hikers, so we weren't worried about the difficulty of the trail. We planned out our route and were ready to take it slow, stop at the scenic spots, and enjoy the time together. The first day was uneventful. We started early, the weather was perfect, and everything felt right. We stopped every few miles to rest, check out the views, and snack. There were other hikers around, but nothing unusual. Everyone was just doing their thing, and we were doing ours. It was our third rest stop that we met them. I can't even remember their names now, but I'll never forget their faces. A couple, maybe in their late 30s, early 40s, came up to us while we were sitting by the side of the trail. They seemed friendly enough at first. Introduced themselves, asked if we were enjoying the hike, the usual small talk. What struck me as odd right away was how much they knew. "We saw you back at the first rest stop," the man said. His voice was smooth, friendly, but there was something off about it, something I couldn't place at the time. "Yeah, we took a quick break there too," Sarah replied, smiling politely. "Nice spot, isn't it?" the woman chimed in. "We noticed you guys are heading toward the summit, right?" It caught me off guard. I mean, of course, we were heading toward the summit. It was the whole point of the hike, but I didn't remember telling them that. We hadn't spoken to anyone else about our plans, at least not in detail. "Yeah," I said, "we're planning to make it to the top by the end of the day, take in the view." "Oh, that's great," the woman said with a smile. "You'll love the view, especially as the sun sets. It's the perfect time to be up there." I gave a polite nod, but the conversation felt strange. Too personal, too familiar, considering we had only just met them. Still, we weren't being rude, so we made small talk for a few more minutes before they left. They waved goodbye, and we watched them continue up the trail. After they left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The way they knew our plans, the way they seemed to be watching us. I didn't want to say anything, not to make the others paranoid, but I felt a sense of unease creeping in. We continued on, but then it happened again. At our next stop, a couple of hours later, they appeared again. Just like before, they came up to us while we were resting. This time, they were asking about our pace, what we planned to do after reaching the summit, how long we thought it would take us. Again, they seemed way too familiar with our plans, asking questions that seemed innocent enough but were unsettling in the way they knew so much. By now, I was feeling uncomfortable. I couldn't explain why, but I knew it wasn't normal for strangers to show up at every stop. I kept looking around, half expecting them to pop out of the trees. Max noticed it too. "Are we being followed?" he asked quietly, leaning in toward me. "I don't know," I said. "But it's weird, right? I mean, how do they know what we're doing?" "I don't know," he said, "but we've only been on this trail for a day. What are the odds they're on the exact same schedule as us?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. We both knew something was off, but we couldn't prove it. And that's what bothered me the most. There was no solid reason to be scared. It was just a feeling, one that kept growing with each encounter. Later that evening, when we made camp, we were all a little on edge. We set up our tents, started a fire, and tried to get some rest. But every time we heard someone approaching, I tensed up. I kept expecting them to appear again, but they didn't. Or at least, not right away. Around dusk, just as the light was fading, the couple appeared once more. This time, they didn't even greet us, they just walked into our camp like they belonged there. "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" the man said, smiling that same unnerving smile. "Yeah, it is," Sarah replied, but I could tell she was getting uncomfortable too. Her voice had that tight, forced quality to it. "We thought we'd check out your campsite," the woman said casually, glancing around. "It's nice. You're all set up for a good night." I wanted to tell them to leave, but I didn't know how. They hadn't done anything wrong exactly. They hadn't crossed any lines that I could point to. But they were too familiar, too intrusive. I could feel my stomach twisting in knots, and I could see that the others were starting to feel the same way. Max cleared his throat. "Well, it's getting late," he said, standing up. We should probably turn in for the night. Big day tomorrow. The couple didn't seem to take the hint. They hung around for another few minutes, making small talk about the weather, about the wildlife in the area, but it wasn't just talk. They were watching us, studying us in a way that made me feel exposed, like they could see every little detail about us, like they were taking notes. Finally, they left, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't done with us. That night, I didn't sleep. Every sound in the woods had me on edge, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig. I kept thinking I heard footsteps outside my tent. I know that sounds paranoid, but after everything that had happened, I couldn't help it. By morning, we were all feeling it. Tired, jumpy, like we couldn't trust anything around us. But we couldn't leave. We were committed to the hike, and there was no way out now. The next day, the couple was there again. This time, they were waiting for us at our next rest stop. They weren't hiding or sneaking around, they were just there, as if they had been waiting for us the whole time. "We've been ahead of you," the man said, like it was no big deal. "It's a nice little stretch of trail up there, but you might want to take it slow. The climb's a bit steeper than it looks." I looked at the others, and I could see the fear in their eyes. We all knew something was wrong now. It wasn't just the coincidences. It wasn't just the way they kept showing up. It was the way they acted, the way they knew things they shouldn't. I don't know what their plan was. I don't know what they wanted from us. But I do know this: by the time we reached the final stretch of the trail, I was done. I told the others we were leaving, that we were cutting the hike short, and I didn't care if we didn't finish. I didn't care if we missed the summit. We turned around and headed back down the trail. This time, we didn't stop at the rest stops. We didn't take any chances. The couple never showed up again, and by the time we got back to our car, I was so relieved I almost didn't care about how weird the whole thing had been. I don't know if they were just strange hikers, or if they had some other reason for following us. But I do know this: I'll never hike that trail again. I went camping alone up in the mountains last spring, just to get away from everything for a few days. It's something I like to do from time to time: the quiet, the solitude, the chance to just clear my mind. I'm not someone who gets nervous easily, especially not in nature. I've been on countless hikes and camping trips. So, when I set up camp at a little clearing just off the main trail, I thought it would be another peaceful night. The weather was perfect, and I was feeling good. I had a small fire going, just enough to cook my dinner and keep the bugs away. It was about dusk, and I was sitting on a log by the fire, eating some canned chili. That's when I heard footsteps. At first, I figured it was a deer or some other animal, but the sound was too steady, too deliberate. I tensed up, standing up slowly and turning toward the noise. Out of the trees stepped a man, maybe in his mid-30s. He looked scruffy, hair long and unkempt, clothes worn and dusty, like he'd been walking for a long time. He didn't look dangerous at first, but something about the way he approached made my stomach tighten. He smiled, and I could tell it wasn't the kind of smile that made you feel at ease. "Hey there," he said, his voice rough, like he hadn't spoken to anyone in days. "You got a minute?" I was hesitant but didn't want to be rude. "Sure. What's up?" "I'm just lost," he said, walking closer to my fire. "Been walking for hours, trying to find the trail again. You wouldn't happen to have a map, would you?" I glanced at the small map I had tucked in my bag and then back at him. Something felt off. His clothes were too worn for someone just out for a hike, and there was a smell to him, damp, musty, and a little like sweat. But I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I offered him a quick smile. Yeah, I've got one, but I'm not sure you're too far off the trail. You should be able to find it if you head north. He nodded like he was listening, but then just stood there. And for a moment, he didn't say anything. His eyes just stayed on me, almost studying me, like he was trying to figure something out. I didn't like the way he was looking at me. It felt like he wasn't interested in finding the trail anymore, like he was waiting for me to invite him to stay. "You camping out here?" he asked, his voice much softer now, like we were having a casual conversation. I wasn't sure how to answer. The tone of his voice had shifted. He wasn't just lost anymore. He was interested in something else. "Yeah, just for a few nights." He nodded again, taking a few steps closer to the fire. Too close. I took a step back without thinking, suddenly feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't want to be rude, but I wasn't about to let some random guy get too close to me in the middle of nowhere. "You alone?" he asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Seems kind of dangerous out here all by yourself, don't it?" I forced a smile, trying to keep the conversation light. "It's not too bad. I'm used to it." He didn't seem convinced. "You ever worry someone might show up, though? Someone like me?" That hit me like a cold wave, and I froze. His words hung in the air, almost like a threat disguised as a joke. I didn't know if I should laugh it off or if I should take it seriously. I decided not to engage, hoping he'd get the hint. "Look, I should probably get some sleep," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's getting late." But he didn't move. Instead, he leaned against a tree, just standing there, staring at me with that same unsettling gaze. "You got a tent set up, or are you just sleeping under the stars?" he asked, his voice calm, but there was something in it, something almost too calm, like he was probing for more. I didn't answer right away. I was trying to keep my thoughts together, but the unease I felt was growing. I glanced at my tent, then back at him. His posture had changed. He was no longer just standing still. He was leaning in slightly, almost like he was waiting for me to say something, anything. "I'm good for the night," I said, trying to sound casual. "I'm just gonna get some rest. You should probably head out before it gets too dark." But he didn't leave. He just kept standing there. I could hear him shifting, like he was trying to make himself comfortable without really moving away. I tried to stay calm, but everything inside me was screaming to just get in the tent and zip myself up. The man took a step closer. "You ever think about what would happen if someone didn't leave?" That was it. That was the moment I realized I was dealing with someone who wasn't just lost. He wasn't just a drifter passing through. He was trying to make me feel small, make me uncomfortable, make me unsure. And in that moment, I knew I had to act. "I think you should go," I said, my voice low but firm. "Now." His smile didn't fade, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something that made the blood in my veins freeze. For a second, he just stood there, looking at me like he was trying to decide whether to push it further. Then, without saying another word, he turned and started walking away, his footsteps slow and deliberate, almost like he was savoring the moment. As he moved further into the trees, I couldn't help but watch him, my heart pounding in my chest. The silence that followed was deafening, and I was still holding my breath, waiting for him to turn around, to come back, too. But he didn't. I didn't sleep that night. I spent the hours lying in my tent, listening to the noises around me. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of the wind in the trees, made my heart race. I was afraid to fall asleep, afraid that he'd come back, or worse, that he'd already be waiting for me outside. At dawn, I packed up my things and left. I didn't care about the hike I had planned. I just wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. I didn't look back. I couldn't. As I drove away, I kept thinking about the way he'd looked at me, about his words. I couldn't shake the feeling that he had known exactly what he was doing. And if I hadn't stood my ground, I don't know what might have happened. I haven't been camping since. I don't know if I ever will again. I can't get the image of him standing there, just watching me, out of my head. I don't think I'll ever feel safe out there again. I remember the day clearly because it started so ordinary. I was working from home, sitting at my desk in the living room with my laptop open. Around mid-morning, the internet went out. I tried resetting the modem a couple of times, but nothing worked. It was frustrating since I had a meeting in less than an hour. Before I could call the service provider, there was a knock on the door. When I opened it, there was a man standing there in a uniform shirt with the company logo stitched on. He had a tool belt around his waist and a clipboard in his hand. "Hi, I'm with the internet service. We got reports of outages in the area," he said. His voice was calm, friendly even. I hadn't called them yet, but I figured someone else must have. I asked if he needed to check anything, and he nodded. "Yeah, I'll need to look at your modem and wiring," he said, glancing past me into the house. I let him in, thinking nothing of it. He followed me to the living room where the modem was. As he worked, he asked questions. At first, they were normal, like how long the internet had been out or if I'd noticed any other issues. Then they started to get personal. "Do you live here alone?" he asked, crouching by the modem. I hesitated but told him no, my husband would be back soon. That wasn't true, my husband was out of town for the week, but something about the question made me uncomfortable. "Oh, good," he said, smiling up at me. "It's nice to have someone around. Makes the place feel less lonely." He finished looking at the modem and stood up. "I'll need to check outside, near the wiring box. Can you show me where that is?" I led him to the back door, pointing out the box on the side of the house. He nodded but didn't go outside right away. Instead, he lingered in the doorway, looking around the kitchen and then back at me. "This is a nice house," he said. "How long have you lived here?" "About 5 years," I said, keeping my answer short now. He stepped closer to the counter, looking at the photos I had pinned on the fridge. "You've got a nice family," he said, pointing at a picture of me, my husband, and our dog. I didn't respond, just stood there, hoping he'd go outside already. After a few more seconds, he finally stepped out the back door. I closed it behind him and locked it. I went back to the living room, watching through the window as he pretended to inspect the wiring box. He wasn't doing much, just walking around, looking at his clipboard, and glancing back at the house. That's when I noticed his van parked on the street. It was plain white, no company logo on the side. My stomach sank. I grabbed my phone and searched for the number for the internet company. When I called, the representative said there hadn't been any technicians dispatched to my area that day. My heart was pounding as I hung up. I went to the front door and peeked through the peephole. The van was still there, and he hadn't come back inside yet, but I knew I needed to act fast. I locked all the doors and windows and ran to the bedroom, grabbing my husband's old baseball bat from the closet. Then I called 911. The operator kept me on the line while I waited for the police. She told me to stay quiet and keep the doors locked. I could barely hear her over the sound of my own breathing. After a few minutes, I heard footsteps on the back porch. He was back, knocking on the door. "Ma'am," he called out. "I need to check something inside again." I didn't answer. The knocking got louder. "Ma'am, Are you there? I just need a few more minutes. I stayed hidden in the bedroom, clutching the bat so tightly my hands hurt. The knocking stopped, and everything went quiet. I thought maybe he'd left, but then I heard a noise at one of the windows. The operator was still on the line, telling me to stay calm. She said officers were on their way. I heard the sound of glass breaking. He was trying to get in. I stayed where I was, shaking and gripping the bat, until I finally heard sirens outside. The police arrived just in time. They found him trying to climb through the broken window. It turned out he wasn't with the internet company at all. He'd stolen the uniform, shirt, and equipment. He had a criminal record, too, for burglary and assault. The police said I did the right thing by not letting him back in and calling 911. They didn't think he was here to fix anything. Even now, I can't stop thinking about how easily I let him into my home. It's terrifying to think about what could have happened if I hadn't trusted my instincts. The train car was mostly empty. It was late, past midnight, and I was heading home after a long shift. I liked riding the train at night. It was quiet, and I could finally let my mind wander. There were only a handful of people scattered around the car, all lost in their own worlds. A man with headphones a few rows ahead of me, a woman in a corner seat scrolling through her phone, and another man sitting diagonally across from me with a notebook in his lap. At first, I didn't notice him. I was staring out the window, watching the city lights blur into streaks against the darkness. But something pulled my attention back. The sound of a pen scratching paper. Not unusual, but it felt persistent, deliberate. I glanced over and saw him hunched over the notebook, his hand moving quickly. He was middle-aged, maybe late 40s, with unkempt hair and a faded jacket. Nothing about him stood out, but the way he was focused on that notebook made me curious. I shifted in my seat to get a better look, but he turned the page before I could make out what he was drawing. His eyes flicked up and met mine for a split second before dropping back down to his notebook. Something about that glance made my skin prickle. I told myself it was nothing. People draw in public all the time. Maybe he was an artist, or just someone passing the time. But then I noticed something strange. The angle of his notebook was tilted toward me, like he wanted me to see but also didn't. It felt intentional. I turned my attention back to the window, trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping over me. But I couldn't ignore it. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him lift his head again, his gaze settling on me before quickly looking away. When the train slowed at the next station, I made a decision. I grabbed my bag, stood up, and moved to the next car. It wasn't far, just through the connecting doors, but it felt safer putting some distance between us. The new car was even emptier, just one man in a suit sleeping against the window. I took a seat near the middle, where I could see both exits. The train jerked forward, and I leaned back, letting out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. But then the door at the end of the car slid open. I looked up and felt my stomach drop. It was him. He didn't hesitate, didn't look around like he was deciding where to sit. He walked straight down the aisle and took a seat a few rows behind me. I could feel his eyes on the back of my head, and my hands clenched around the strap of my bag. I told myself I was imagining things. He could have just been moving cars for the same reason I had. Maybe he wanted more space, or maybe he didn't like the vibe in the last car. But it didn't feel like that. It felt deliberate. The train stopped again, and I decided to test it. I stood up, walked to the door, and stepped into the next car. This one was brighter, with more people. A couple chatting quietly, a man reading a book. I sat near the door, keeping my eyes on the connecting passage. It didn't take long. A minute later, the door slid open and he stepped through. His eyes scanned the car until they landed on me. He didn't even pretend to look for another seat. He just sat down, closer this time, just 2 rows behind me. My heart was pounding now. I fumbled with my phone, opening a message thread and typing out a quick text to my roommate. There's a guy following me on the train. What do I do? I hit send and waited, staring at the screen like it was a lifeline. She didn't reply right away, and I didn't know if she was asleep or if the message hadn't gone through. The train rattled on, the hum of the tracks filling the silence. I could feel his gaze, even though I didn't turn around to check. The next station came into view, and I made a split-second decision. When the doors opened, I stepped off the train. I didn't plan to leave, I just wanted to see if he would follow. The platform was empty except for a janitor sweeping near the stairs. I stayed close to the edge, watching the doors. For a moment, I thought maybe I was wrong, that he would stay on the train and this would all just be a weird story to laugh about later. But then he stepped off. He stood on the platform, his notebook tucked under his arm. He didn't approach me, didn't say anything, just stood there watching. The doors closed behind him, and the train pulled away, leaving us in silence. I backed toward the stairs, my pulse racing. Can I help you? I finally managed to say, my voice shaking. He tilted his head slightly, like he was considering my question. Then he opened the notebook and turned it toward me. The pages were filled with sketches. My face, my posture, even the way I had been sitting by the window. Page after page, all of me. I felt frozen, my legs refusing to move. Why are you doing this? I asked, barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. Instead, he smiled, closed the notebook, and took a step forward. I bolted. My legs finally worked, and I ran up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. I didn't look back until I reached the street, my lungs burning and my heart threatening to burst out of my chest. When I turned, he wasn't there. The platform was empty, the station eerily quiet. I didn't stop running until I reached a gas station a few blocks away. The clerk gave me a strange look as I stumbled inside, breathless and disheveled. Call the police, I said, my voice cracking. There's a man following me. They came quickly, but by the time they searched the station, he was gone. I filed a report, described him as best as I could, but they didn't seem hopeful. These things happen, one of the officers said, like it was supposed to make me feel better. I didn't sleep that night. Or the night after. It's been weeks, and I can't stop thinking about that notebook. About how many sketches there were. About how long he must have been watching me. I still take the train, but never alone. And I always sit near the conductor's car, where there are people around. But every time I hear the sound of a pen scratching paper, I feel my chest tighten, and I can't help but look over my shoulder. I didn't think it would be a big deal. Moving into a shared apartment to save money seemed like the most practical option. I'd been living in a cramped studio for a while, struggling to make rent on my own, and the idea of splitting costs with someone else felt like a relief. It was supposed to be temporary, just until I got on my feet, figured things out. I found the listing online, and the place seemed perfect. Affordable, in a nice neighborhood, close to work. The only catch was that my new roommate, Sarah, was someone I didn't know. But that wasn't a huge red flag. I'd seen worse situations, people meeting roommates through random ads. So, I decided to take a leap. We met for coffee before the move-in date. She seemed friendly enough, quiet, a little reserved, but not in a way that made me uncomfortable. She worked from home, which was nice because it meant we didn't have to coordinate schedules around who would be using the bathroom in the morning. I liked the idea of having a steady, calm presence in the apartment. The first few weeks went by without issue. We exchanged small talk when we crossed paths in the kitchen, shared the occasional meal, and otherwise respected each other's space. She'd occasionally ask if I wanted to join her for a walk or watch a movie, but I was always too tired or busy. The workday felt long, and I wasn't exactly in the mood to socialize. But then, little things started to change. I noticed Sarah seemed very interested in my schedule. At first, it wasn't anything alarming. She casually asked if I had plans for the weekend, what time I worked the next day, or if I had any errands to run. I figured she was just being friendly, trying to make conversation. Maybe she was just one of those people who liked to know what was going on in the lives of others. But after a while, it felt less like small talk and more like tracking. One evening, I was getting ready to leave for a dinner with a friend, and Sarah asked, "Oh, are you going to the Thai place on Maple Street again?" I froze for a moment, surprised. "Yeah. How did you know?" She smiled, not in an awkward way, but in a way that made me feel uneasy. "You mentioned it last week." I just remember things. I shrugged it off, but something about the way she said it stuck with me. The next day, I found her in the living room while I was getting ready to leave for work. She was sitting on the couch, watching a show on her laptop. "Do you need anything from the store?" she asked casually. "No, I'm good," I said, grabbing my purse. "Why?" "I was just wondering if you needed any snacks. You usually buy the same kind of granola bars every week." That was strange. I hadn't mentioned my snacks to her, but she was right. I did buy the same ones every week. Still, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just an offhand observation. But then things got worse. Over the next few weeks, Sarah started commenting on more personal things. She'd ask about the photos I had around the apartment, about the books on my shelf. She'd ask if I had plans for my days off, how long I was planning to be at work, when I'd be coming home. And then, the worst part. I came back from work one afternoon and found that my makeup bag had been moved. I was sure I'd left it in the drawer by the bathroom sink, but now it was sitting on the edge of the countertop, a little too neatly arranged. At first, I thought maybe I'd just been forgetful. Maybe I'd moved it and didn't remember. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt wrong. The bag wasn't just moved, it was as if someone had gone through it. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid. I didn't want to accuse her of something without proof. Then, one night, I came home late. Sarah was already in bed, but I noticed the lights in the kitchen were on. I walked in, and she was sitting at the table, scribbling in a notebook. She looked up at me with wide eyes, almost startled. "Oh, hey. I didn't hear you come in." I nodded, trying to stay calm. "What are you doing up this late?" "Just writing." She smiled, but it wasn't a smile that put me at ease. It was too tight. I glanced at the notebook. "What are you writing about?" She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of the pages. "Just some things. Stuff for work." I didn't press it any further, but the whole interaction felt off. The next morning, I woke up to find my car keys missing from the bowl by the door. I looked everywhere, but they were gone. I even checked Sarah's room, but the door was locked, and she wasn't home. It took me a few hours to find them, tucked into the pocket of the jacket I had left hanging on the back of the chair in the kitchen. I had no idea how they got there. That's when the thoughts started to pile up, one after another. Was I just overthinking things? Or was Sarah really doing something she shouldn't be? One evening, I decided to confront her. I had enough. "Sarah," I said, sitting across from her at the table, "I need to ask you something." She looked up from her phone, a little too quickly, as if she'd been waiting for this. "Sure, what's up?" "I've noticed some things, with my stuff, my schedule. And I just need to know if you've been going through my things." Her smile faltered for a split second, but then she regained her composure. "What do you mean?" "The makeup bag. The keys. You've been asking about my plans all the time. You know where I go and when I'm back. It's a little too much." She didn't react the way I expected. Instead of getting defensive or upset, she leaned forward, her expression unnervingly calm. "I'm just trying to be friendly, you know? I like getting to know people. And you're interesting. You have such an interesting routine. I was just curious." I couldn't breathe. I wasn't sure if I was scared or disgusted, but I knew then that I couldn't stay. I didn't want to feel like I was being watched in my own home. "I think I'm going to find a new place to live," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't look surprised. In fact, she smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile anymore. It was something darker. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "I understand," she said softly. "You'll be missed." That night, I packed my things. I didn't care about the rent I'd already paid. I didn't care about the mess I left behind. I just needed to get out. I didn't hear from her again after I moved out. No calls, no messages, no notes. I don't know if she was just being friendly or if she was keeping tabs on me. Either way, I didn't want to stick around long enough to find out. I still don't understand what was going through her head, and I don't know if she was actually dangerous or if I was just overreacting. We were about halfway through our planned 3-day hike in Redwood Ridge National Park when we first saw him. He was sitting on a rock near the trail, hunched over and rubbing his ankle. His backpack was slung carelessly next to him, and his clothes were dirty, like he'd been out there longer than planned. There were 5 of us in our group: me, my boyfriend Jake, and 3 of our friends. We weren't new to hiking, but this was one of our more ambitious trips. The trails here were isolated, and the cell service was non-existent. The man looked up as we approached, his face drawn and pale. He was probably in his mid-30s, with dark circles under his eyes and a scruffy beard that looked like it hadn't seen a razor in weeks. "Hey," he said, his voice hoarse. "You guys have any water?" Jake handed him one of our spare bottles without hesitation. The guy gulped it down like he hadn't had a drink in hours. "Thanks," he said, wiping his mouth. "I've been out here for a while. Got turned around off the trail yesterday, and my ankle's been giving me trouble." "You're alone?" I asked, glancing around. "Yeah. Stupid, right? I figured I'd be fine doing a solo trip, but..." He gestured to his ankle and gave a sheepish smile. "Not my smartest move." He introduced himself as Eric, and we spent a few minutes chatting with him. He seemed harmless, just another hiker who'd underestimated the difficulty of the trails. He asked if he could tag along with us until we got back to the main trailhead, and after a brief group discussion, we agreed. It felt wrong to leave him out there alone, especially if he was injured. As we started walking again, Eric fell into step with us. At first, everything seemed normal. He was friendly enough, asking us where we were from and how long we'd been hiking. But after a while, his questions started to feel off. "So, none of you brought a gun or anything?" he asked casually, glancing back at Jake. Jake shook his head. No need. It's a national park. We've got bear spray, though. Eric chuckled. Bear spray won't help you much against a person. The comment hung in the air, and no one responded. I caught Jake's eye, and he gave me a small shrug, like he didn't think it was worth making a big deal out of. A little later, Eric started talking about survival tactics, how easy it was to get lost in the woods, how most people wouldn't survive more than a day or two without supplies. He had this way of talking that made my skin crawl, like he was enjoying the idea of people being vulnerable out here. By the time the sun started to dip below the horizon, I was ready to call it a night. We found a clearing to set up camp, and Eric offered to help gather firewood. Jake and one of our friends, Sarah, went with him, while the rest of us stayed behind to set up the tents. When they came back, Eric was carrying an armful of branches and grinning like he'd just won a prize. Found a good spot a little ways off the trail, he said. Secluded, nice and quiet. Could be worth checking out tomorrow. That was the first real red flag. The spot we were in was already plenty secluded, and we were trying to stick to marked trails as much as possible. None of us wanted to get lost out here, especially not with someone we barely knew. We didn't say anything at the time, though. It felt awkward to question him when he hadn't done anything blatantly wrong. But later, as we sat around the fire eating dinner, I noticed Jake watching Eric closely. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound outside the tent made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next morning, Eric was up before any of us, pacing near the fire pit. When we started packing up, he brought up the spot he'd mentioned the night before. Seriously, you guys should see it, he said. It's only a mile or two off the main trail. I could show you. Jake hesitated, then shook his head. We've got a route planned already. Don't want to get sidetracked. Eric's smile faltered for a moment, but then he nodded. Fair enough. Guess I'll just stick with you guys for now. The day felt tense from the start. Eric kept lagging behind or wandering off, only to reappear a few minutes later. He didn't seem as friendly anymore either. His questions became more personal: how much food we packed, how often we went hiking, whether we told anyone exactly where we were going. By late afternoon, I was starting to panic. Jake and I talked quietly while Eric was out of earshot, and we agreed that we needed to lose him. We waited until we reached a fork in the trail. Jake announced that we decided to take the left path, even though it wasn't part of our original plan. Eric frowned but didn't argue. An hour later, we realized he'd been leading us in circles. The trail markers disappeared, replaced by dense trees and undergrowth. When we stopped to check the map, Eric laughed. Looks like we're a little off course, he said, his tone light but his eyes cold. Jake stepped in front of me, his posture tense. We need to get back to the main trail. Now. Eric shrugged. Sure. But it's getting dark. Might be better to set up camp and figure it out in the morning. No, Jake said firmly. We're leaving. Eric's smile disappeared completely. He stared at Jake for a long moment, then nodded. Suit yourself. He didn't follow us after that. We hurried back the way we come, eventually finding a marked trail again. When we reported the incident to the park rangers the next day, they seemed concerned but unsurprised. Apparently, there had been other reports of a man matching Eric's description, someone who claimed to be lost but led hikers off the trails. We never found out what his endgame was, and I don't want to know. All I know is that we were lucky to get away before we found out. It started on a Wednesday morning, One of those quiet days where nothing seems out of place. I was home alone, working in my makeshift office near the front of the house. The neighborhood was still, with most people off at work or school. The only sounds were the occasional car passing by and the faint hum of the heater kicking in. Around 10 o'clock, there was a knock at the door. Not a casual tap-tap, but 3 firm knocks. It startled me enough that I jumped, spilling some coffee onto my desk. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the doorbell hadn't rung. I debated ignoring it, but curiosity won out. When I opened the door, a man stood on the porch. He was middle-aged, clean-shaven, and dressed in a plain button-up shirt and slacks. He carried a clipboard and wore a badge clipped to his pocket. The badge looked official enough, though I couldn't make out what it said from where I stood. "Good morning," he said with a polite smile. "Sorry to bother you. I'm with the city's survey department. We're conducting property evaluations in the area, and I just need to confirm a few details about your home." His tone was professional, his demeanor calm. There was nothing inherently alarming about him, but something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was how he kept glancing past me, like he was trying to look inside the house. "Ah, sure," I said, hesitantly. "What do you need to know?" He looked down at his clipboard and flipped through a few papers. "I just need to verify some basic information. Number of bedrooms, bathrooms, square footage, things like that. It's for the city records." I hesitated. Wouldn't that information already be on file? His smile didn't falter, but there was a slight pause before he answered. "Sometimes the records aren't updated accurately. It's just a quick confirmation." I didn't love the idea of giving out details about my house to a stranger, even one claiming to be from the city. "Do you have any identification?" I asked, keeping my hand on the door. "Of course," he said, reaching for the badge on his pocket. He held it up, but not close enough for me to see it clearly. "See? Official surveyor. I can give you a contact number if you'd like to confirm." Something about the way he said it made my stomach twist. His badge looked generic, the kind you could order online. The name on it didn't match the department logo. My gut told me this wasn't right, and I decided to trust it. "I'm sorry," I said firmly, "but I'm not comfortable sharing information about my home. If you need anything, you can contact me through the proper channels." His smile faded, and his expression shifted ever so slightly. It wasn't anger, but something colder. "All right," he said after a moment, his tone still polite but clipped. "No problem. Have a good day." He turned and walked away, heading down the driveway toward the street. I watched him go, noting how he didn't stop at any of my neighbors' houses. He just got into a gray sedan parked a few houses down and drove off. I stood there for a moment, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that settled over me. The encounter didn't sit right, but I convinced myself it was probably nothing. Maybe he was legit, and I'd just been overly cautious. Better safe than sorry, I told myself. That night, I locked the doors and windows as usual. I double-checked everything, even though I didn't always do that. It wasn't paranoia, I told myself, just being careful. The next morning, I found the back gate open. It wasn't broken or hanging off its hinges, just unlatched. I knew I had closed it the day before because I'd let the dog out after lunch. I always made a point to latch it afterward. I walked around the yard, looking for anything out of place. That's when I noticed faint footprints in the dirt near the side of the house. They were too big to be mine and too fresh to be old. I knelt down to get a better look, and my heart sank. They led straight to one of the windows. The window screen had been tampered with. It wasn't torn, but it had been partially pried away from the frame. Whoever did it didn't get inside. The window was still locked, but the attempt was clear. Someone had been here. My mind immediately went to the city surveyor from the day before. His questions, his clipboard, the way he looked past me into the house, it all clicked. He wasn't from the city. He had been scouting my home, testing whether I'd be an easy target. I called the police and filed a report. The officer who came to the house listened carefully as I described the man and what had happened. He nodded as I spoke, his expression grim. "This isn't the first time we've heard about something like this," he said. "There's been a few reports of people posing as utility workers or city officials to gain access to homes." He took down all the details I could remember, the man's appearance, his car, the fake badge, and assured me they'd investigate. But there wasn't much they could do without more information. "Just be vigilant," he said before leaving. "If you see him again, call us immediately." For the next few days, I felt like I was living in a bubble of paranoia. Every noise outside made me jump. I kept all the blinds closed and checked the locks multiple times a day. I even installed a camera above the front door, something I'd been meaning to do for months but had always put off. Then, a week later, I spotted the gray sedan parked down the street again. It was the same car, I was sure of it. It sat there for hours, the windows tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, the car was gone. I haven't seen the man since, but the experience has stayed with me. It's the kind of thing that makes you question everything, that makes you second-guess every knock at the door. I still don't know what he was planning, but I'm grateful I trusted my instincts that day. It might have saved me from something far worse. It happened on a stretch of highway I've driven more times than I can count. It's one of those roads that feels endless, surrounded by flat fields, no landmarks, nothing to break the monotony. The kind of road where the sky feels too big, and you start counting the minutes until you're off it. It was late, maybe 10 or 11 at night. I was driving back from visiting a friend a couple of towns over. I had the radio low and the windows cracked open to keep myself awake. There weren't many cars out, just me, the occasional truck, and a dark sky that felt heavier than usual. At first, I didn't notice the car behind me. It was just headlights in the distance, blending in like they always do. But after a while, I realized they weren't getting any closer or farther away. They stayed there, hanging back at the same distance no matter how much I sped up or slowed down. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe they were just keeping a steady pace, like I was. But the more I watched them in the rearview mirror, the more I felt like something was off. Every time I switched lanes, they did the same, like they were copying me. I decided to test it. I slowed down, almost to a crawl for the highway, to see if they would pass me. They didn't. Instead, they slowed down too, keeping the same distance. My heart started to pick up then. I wasn't scared yet, but I was definitely on edge. I tried to shake them off by speeding up again, going a little faster than I was comfortable with. For a second, I thought it worked. Their headlights faded back a little, and I thought they finally decided to stop tailing me. But then, they sped up too, closing the gap. That was when I knew something was wrong. This wasn't normal. I told myself to stay calm. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe they were just heading the same direction, and I was overthinking it. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I glanced at the GPS and saw there was an exit coming up in a couple of miles. It wasn't the one I needed, but I decided to take it anyway. If they followed me, I'd know for sure. The exit was one of those lonely off-ramps that dumps you onto a smaller road surrounded by nothing but darkness. As I took the turn, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, hoping to see them continue down the highway. They didn't. The car followed me, turning onto the same road. That was when the fear really hit me. My hands felt slick on the steering wheel, and my chest was tight. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew it wasn't good. The smaller road was even emptier than the highway. No streetlights, no cars, just a faint glow of my headlights and theirs. I thought about pulling over to let them pass, but something about the way they were driving made me think that wasn't a good idea. I kept going, trying to stay calm and think straight. The car behind me started getting closer, their headlights brighter in my mirror. I could feel the tension in my shoulders, my whole body bracing for something. Then, out of nowhere, they sped up and swerved into the next lane, coming up beside me. I glanced over and saw a man in the driver's seat. I couldn't make out much, just a shadowy figure with one hand on the wheel, staring straight ahead. He didn't look at me, but the way his car drifted closer to mine felt deliberate. He was trying to push me off the road. Panic set in. I gripped the wheel tighter, trying to keep my car steady as he kept edging closer. I honked my horn, hoping it would scare him off or at least make him back off. It didn't. He stayed right there, his car inches from mine, forcing me toward the shoulder. I tried to speed up, but he matched my pace. I couldn't go any faster without losing control. My car started to drift toward the gravel at the side of the road, and I felt the tires start to slip. I swerved back into the lane, barely missing him, and he fell back for a moment. I thought maybe he'd given up, but then he was right there again, this time coming up behind me. His headlights filled my mirrors, blinding me, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't know what to do. There were no other cars around, no gas stations or stores, nothing but darkness and an endless road. I kept driving, hoping to see some kind of sign or turnoff where I could get away. Then I saw it, a narrow side road coming up on the left. It wasn't marked, just a gap in the trees that looked like it might go somewhere. I didn't have a plan, but I took it. I yanked the wheel and turned hard, the tires screeching as I veered off the main road. The side road was rough, gravel kicking up under my tires, but I kept going. I glanced in the mirror and saw the other car hesitate for a second before following me. My heart sank. He wasn't giving up. The road twisted and turned, narrowing as it went. I couldn't go as fast as I wanted without risking a crash. The other car stayed close, his headlights bouncing in my mirror, but he wasn't trying to push me anymore. I wondered if he was waiting for me to make a mistake, to slow down or stop. Then I saw it, a small clearing up ahead with a cluster of houses. Relief flooded me. I didn't care whose house it was, I just needed to get to where someone could see me. I gunned the engine and pulled into the driveway of the first house I saw, slamming the brakes and throwing the car into park. The other car stopped at the edge of the clearing, just sitting there with its headlights on. I jumped out of my car and ran to the front door of the house, banging on it and yelling for help. It felt like an eternity before someone answered. An older man opened the door, looking confused and alarmed. I barely managed to get the words out, telling him someone was following me, trying to run me off the road. He stepped outside and looked toward the driveway, but the car was gone. I stood there, shaking and trying to catch my breath, while he called the police. They came and took my statement, but there wasn't much they could do. I didn't get a good look at the driver, and there were no cameras on the road where it happened. I don't drive that stretch of highway at night anymore. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I can't stop thinking about how deliberate it all felt. He wasn't just messing around. He was trying to scare me, or worse. I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully explain this. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I'm driving through empty stretches of road. It happened a little over a year ago, but I can't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I've traveled alone a lot before, but this time, well, let me just tell you what happened. It was late at night. I was driving across the country, headed to a small town in the middle of nowhere. It was the kind of drive where you're miles away from any real civilization, just long stretches of dark roads and occasional small towns. I had been on the road for hours, and my gas gauge was starting to dip into the red, so I pulled off the main road to stop at a gas station I saw in the distance. I didn't think anything of it. The place looked normal enough from the outside, a small, rundown gas station with one of those old, flickering lights above the door. The only car at the pumps was a beat-up pickup truck with a thick layer of dirt on it. I parked near the pump and got out, stretching my legs and trying to shake off the exhaustion. I noticed the gas station attendant almost immediately. He was standing behind the counter inside, watching me as I walked up to the door. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with a scruffy beard and a baseball cap. He had the look of someone who'd been doing this job for years, probably in the middle of nowhere for most of his life. His eyes were wide, a little too wide, and he seemed jittery, like he was on edge. I couldn't help but feel a little off just from looking at him. I opened the door and walked inside. He was still watching me, but didn't say anything at first. I grabbed a bottle of water and some chips, then walked up to the counter. He didn't even ask how I was doing or if I needed anything else. Instead, he just looked at me and said, "You need to leave. You need to go. Now." I froze. I thought I heard him wrong. I glanced around, expecting maybe a big storm or something outside. But everything seemed fine. It was just dark, quiet, and nothing seemed out of place. I chuckled nervously, thinking he was joking, and asked, "What's wrong?" His voice dropped low, almost like a whisper. "Just leave. You don't want to be here when they come through." I didn't know what to make of it. I figured he was just some paranoid guy. Maybe he had a rough night or something. But the urgency in his voice, the way he kept looking at the window like he was expecting someone, it didn't feel right. I paid for my stuff quickly, thinking I should just get going, but when I turned to leave, I saw a truck pull up outside. It wasn't the beat-up pickup anymore. It was a black SUV, one of those big ones that look intimidating, like the kind of car you'd see in a movie when someone's trying to make a dramatic entrance. It rolled up slowly, stopping just a little too close to my car. I stepped outside, trying to stay calm. My first instinct was to just get in my car and leave. I wasn't looking to get into any weird situation in the middle of nowhere. But as I approached my car, the door of the SUV opened. A man got out, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket. He didn't say anything, just watched me. I could feel my stomach tighten, a weird, uneasy feeling creeping up on me. I walked faster, trying not to look directly at him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was staring right at me. My hand was on the door handle when I heard a voice behind me. "Hey!" I turned around. It was the gas station attendant, standing in the doorway now. "You need to leave. Get in your car and don't stop. Go!" His face was pale, almost gray, and he was sweating. I could tell he was genuinely scared. I didn't know what to do. The man from the SUV was still watching me, not moving, not saying a word. I could see that he was just standing there like he was waiting for something, or maybe someone. I got in my car quickly, locking the door behind me. I started the engine, and just as I was about to put it in reverse, the man from the SUV stepped in front of my car. I slammed my foot on the brake, the tires screeching a little as I stopped just inches from him. He didn't move. He didn't even blink. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my palms starting to sweat as I stared at him, trying to figure out what to do. The attendant was still standing in the doorway of the gas station, watching us both. He didn't seem like he was going to intervene. He just stood there, his hands trembling. I didn't know if this guy was going to hurt me or what. I considered just driving off, even if I had to run him over, but something told me it wasn't a good idea. I was in the middle of nowhere, in a place I didn't know. The gas station attendant's warning was still ringing in my head, and I wasn't sure I wanted to take any chances. Finally, the man moved. Slowly, deliberately, he took a step back and gestured toward the road. He didn't say anything, but I could tell from the look on his face that he wanted me to go. I didn't need any more encouragement. I didn't wait for him to move completely out of the way. I just threw the car in reverse and sped off, not looking back. I didn't stop until I was miles down the road, my hands still shaking on the wheel. I don't know who those people were, or what they were planning, but I've never felt so unsafe in my life. The gas station attendant's face kept flashing in my mind, his fear so palpable, like he knew something I didn't. Like he knew I had to leave before it was too late. I didn't stop anywhere else that night, and I didn't trust any more gas stations on that trip. I didn't feel safe, and I didn't want to find out what would have happened if I had stayed any longer. I still don't know what they were up to, and I don't think I want to. Sometimes, when I drive alone now, I wonder if I'll ever run into them again. It's hard to know where to begin with this. I think it's taken me so long to write this because it still feels like a bad dream. Even now, when I think about it, I can't shake the feeling that something went horribly wrong that day, something that could have been avoided if we just made different choices. We were all experienced hikers, at least a little, and we'd planned this trip for months. The idea was to camp in the mountains for a weekend, just to disconnect from everything. It was supposed to be simple. We'd done this kind of thing before, just not in this particular area. The weather had been fine the whole trip, and the first couple of days went off without a hitch. We had our laughs, we cooked our meals over a fire, and everything felt normal, almost too normal. By the third day, we were packing up to head back. It was late afternoon, and we had been moving slowly through the trails, not wanting to rush. But when we reached a certain point, one of the guys, Mark, suggested taking a shortcut. He'd been to this area a few times before, and apparently, this canyon was a faster way back to our camp. We all thought it was a good idea. We had a little time to spare, and the weather was holding up. It seemed like a quick detour that would save us some hours. None of us thought twice when Mark led the way. The canyon was narrow, with sheer rock walls on either side, but it didn't look dangerous. In fact, it looked beautiful in a way, like something out of a postcard. We walked through, chatting and laughing, taking in the view, oblivious to how quickly the time was slipping away. It wasn't until we'd gotten about halfway through that we noticed something wasn't right. At first, it was just a small sound, like gravel shifting behind us. Then it happened again. And again. It was almost like something was moving behind us, but when we turned around, there was nothing there. I remember feeling uneasy but brushing it off as nothing. Maybe just the rocks shifting, or the wind, who knows? But as we kept walking, the sound grew louder. It was like it was getting closer, and I could tell by the looks on everyone else's faces that they were starting to feel it too. But Mark, he didn't seem concerned. He kept saying it was nothing and urged us to keep going. We trusted him. That was our first mistake. I'm not sure what exactly happened after that. Maybe the sound was the beginning of it, or maybe it was just bad luck. But all of a sudden, the ground beneath us started to shake. It wasn't just a small tremor. The rocks above us began to shift, and before any of us could react, the entire side of the canyon gave way. I remember the sound first, the screech of stone scraping against stone, the crashing and rumbling as the rocks began to tumble down. And then the dust. It was like the world went gray all at once. I couldn't breathe, couldn't see, and I remember feeling the ground jerk beneath me. The next thing I knew, I was on the ground, trying to cover my face from the dirt and rocks. I could hear the others yelling, but everything was muffled. The chaos was overwhelming, like the world was collapsing in on itself. When the dust finally started to settle, I opened my eyes. The canyon walls had changed. What had once been a clear path was now a mess of rocks and debris, completely blocking our way. Mark was the closest to me, his face covered in dirt, but he was alive. I could see he was trying to stand, his legs shaky. We all helped each other up, but the reality of the situation hit hard. We were trapped. The narrow canyon we'd been walking through was now impassable, and there was no way to climb out. I remember looking up and realizing that the canyon walls were too steep, too smooth to climb. And no matter how many times we shouted, no one came. We were completely alone. There were no other hikers, no signs of life, just the sound of the wind and our panic breathing. I looked around at the others. We had a few supplies of water, some food, our basic camping gear, but nothing that could help us get out of there. The worst part was the silence. It felt like we were miles from help, and in that moment, it hit me that no one knew where we were. We hadn't checked in with anyone, and I wasn't sure anyone even knew which way we'd gone. We hadn't planned for something like this. The first few hours were spent trying to move the rocks, trying to dig our way out, but it was useless. Every time we thought we found a way through, more rocks would shift, making it harder to get through. We had enough water to last us a while, but that didn't make the fear go away. It was becoming clear that our time was running out. We couldn't stay here. We needed to get out. By nightfall, things got worse. It was already getting cold, and the air was thick with dust. We huddled together for warmth, but I could tell we were all exhausted. Mark was the one trying to keep everyone calm, but even he seemed rattled. No one said it out loud, but we all knew it, we were stuck. No one was coming to help, and the rocks above us could still fall. We rationed the food and water, but with the days dragging on, it didn't seem like it would be enough. The next morning, we made a decision. There wasn't much we could do at that point, but we had to try something. We needed to get to higher ground to see if we could find a way out. But even that felt like a stretch. As we moved toward the top of the canyon, trying to find a way through the rocks, one of the guys, Sam, tripped and twisted his ankle. It wasn't just a sprain. The way he screamed when he fell, I knew it was bad. We had to stop and tend to him, and that delayed us even further. But in the back of my mind, I knew that we were running out of time. The reality was starting to sink in. After a few days, when it seemed like we might not make it out, something changed. We had all been silently wondering if it was possible that we weren't alone in this canyon. The silence around us was so complete that it felt unnatural. And then, one afternoon, Mark disappeared. I don't know how he did it. I don't know if he was trying to find help, or if he'd just gone crazy, but he was gone. He'd left without a word. We searched for hours, but there was no sign of him. It felt like he just vanished. That's when I knew we weren't going to make it out without help. It was too dangerous to keep going alone. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, I managed to climb up to the top of the canyon, to a small ledge where I could get a better view. From there, I could see the main trail that we had taken days earlier. I could see the small stream where we had camped, just a few miles away. I knew we had to make it. It wasn't much, but it was the only chance we had left. We made it back to camp just in time. It was a hard climb down, and Sam was still hurt, but we made it. I don't know how we survived that canyon, but we did. We were lucky, I guess. I still don't know what happened to Mark,